Deep within the sacred mountains of Diné, the ancestral homeland of the Diné people, lies a creation story that predates written history by countless generations. This narrative, passed down through the voices of medicine people and elders, contains within its complex layers the fundamental principles that would eventually give birth to one of Native American mythology's most feared and misunderstood concepts, the Skinwalker. To comprehend the true nature of these shape-shifting beings, one must first journey back to the very beginning of Diné cosmology, where the seeds of this dark knowledge were first planted in the spiritual consciousness of the people. The Diné creation story unfolds across multiple worlds, each representing a stage in the spiritual and physical evolution of existence itself. According to traditional teachings, the holy people, known as Diné, guided the emergence of life through 4 distinct worlds before arriving at the current 5th world, where humanity now dwells. This progression was not merely a physical journey but a profound spiritual transformation that established the eternal struggle between positive and negative forces that would define all subsequent existence. In the first world, called the Black World or Nihodilkil, the fundamental concepts of order and chaos first manifested. Here, the earliest beings possessed the ability to change form at will, moving between different states of existence as naturally as breathing. This primordial shape-shifting capability was not inherently evil, but represented the fluid nature of creation itself. The beings of this world could transform into various animal forms, adopt different appearances, and manipulate their physical essence according to their spiritual needs. However, even in this earliest realm, the potential for corruption existed alongside the potential for harmony. The progression through the second world, the blue world or Nihodotlech, and the third world, the yellow world or Nihaltso, saw the gradual establishment of more defined spiritual laws and boundaries. Each transition brought greater complexity to the relationship between the physical and spiritual realms, and with this complexity came the increasing possibility of spiritual transgression. The holy people began to establish protocols and taboos that would govern the proper use of transformative powers, recognizing that such abilities could be turned toward destructive purposes if wielded without proper spiritual guidance and moral restraint. The emergence into the 4th world, the White World or Nihodilkil, marked a crucial turning point in the development of what would eventually become Skinwalker mythology. It was in this world that first man, Altse Hastien, and first woman, Altse Astza, began their roles as the primary architects of human spiritual and social order. These primordial beings possessed intimate knowledge of transformation magic and understood both its potential benefits and its terrible dangers. Their experiences and the laws they established would form the foundation upon which all subsequent spiritual practices would be built. First man and first woman were not merely the first humans, but served as intermediaries between the holy people and the emerging human consciousness. They possessed the ability to communicate with animals, to understand the language of the wind and the wisdom of the stones, and to transform their physical appearance when necessary for survival or spiritual purposes. However, they also witnessed firsthand the consequences of using such powers for selfish or harmful purposes, as various beings in their world fell prey to the temptation to use transformation magic for personal gain rather than communal harmony. The narrative of first man and first woman includes numerous instances where they encountered beings who'd corrupted their natural shape-shifting abilities. These corrupted entities served as cautionary examples of what could happen when the sacred gift of transformation was perverted by jealousy, greed, or malicious intent. Some beings became trapped in animal forms, unable to return to their original state due to their spiritual corruption. Others developed an insatiable hunger for power that drove them to prey upon weaker beings, using their transformation abilities to deceive and destroy rather than to heal and protect. Through these encounters, first man and first woman learned to distinguish between legitimate spiritual transformation and the dark perversion of natural abilities that would later be associated with Skinwalker practices. They observed that those who used transformation magic in harmony with natural law maintained their spiritual balance and continued to serve the greater good of their community. Conversely, those who violated spiritual protocols and used their powers for selfish purposes gradually lost their connection to the holy people and became something fundamentally different from their original nature. The spiritual framework established by First Man and First Woman included specific prohibitions against certain types of transformation magic. They recognized that while the ability to change form was a natural part of existence, the deliberate adoption of predatory animal characteristics for the purpose of harming others represented a fundamental violation of cosmic order. These early spiritual laws would later be codified into the complex system of taboos and protocols that govern traditional Diné spiritual practices to this day. As First Man and First Woman continued their journey through the Fourth World, they encountered the holy people who would teach them the proper ways to conduct spiritual ceremonies and maintain harmony between the human and supernatural realms. These holy people, including figures such as Changing Woman, Monster Slayer, and Born for Water, provided detailed instructions on how to use spiritual power responsibly and how to recognize and combat those who had chosen to corrupt their abilities. The concept of spiritual balance became central to the emerging worldview that First Man and First Woman would pass down to their descendants. This balance was not a static state, but a dynamic equilibrium that required constant attention and maintenance. The holy people taught that every positive spiritual force had the potential to become negative if not properly channeled, and that every individual possessed the capacity for both great good and terrible evil. The choice between these paths was always present, and the consequences of choosing wrongly could extend far beyond the individual to affect entire communities and future generations. The connection between Skinwalker mythology and the sacred four directions emerged during this formative period in Diné spiritual development. Each direction was associated with specific holy people, particular colours, sacred mountains, and distinct spiritual qualities. The East, associated with white and the power of dawn, represented new beginnings and spiritual illumination. The South, linked with turquoise and the heat of midday, embodied growth and the full manifestation of power. The West, connected with yellow and the setting sun, symbolized maturity and the wisdom that comes with experience. The North, associated with black and the deep night, represented the completion of cycles and the mysterious forces that govern transformation and change. Within this directional framework, the holy people established specific protocols for spiritual practice that would serve as protection against the corruption of natural abilities. Each direction had its own set of ceremonial requirements, its own spiritual guardians, and its own particular vulnerabilities to spiritual attack. Those who sought to pervert their transformation abilities often did so by deliberately violating the protocols associated with one or more directions, thereby cutting themselves off from the protective influence of the holy people and opening themselves to malevolent spiritual forces. The holy people of each direction possessed their own unique characteristics and areas of spiritual authority. Those associated with the East were primarily concerned with healing, purification, and the restoration of spiritual balance. The holy people of the South focused on growth, abundance, and the proper use of power during the peak periods of life. Western holy people specialized in wisdom, teaching, and the guidance of souls through difficult transitions. The Northern holy people governed the mysteries of death and rebirth, transformation and renewal, and the deep spiritual forces that operated beyond ordinary human understanding. It was particularly in the realm of the Northern holy people that the potential for spiritual corruption was most pronounced. The transformative powers associated with this direction were the most potent and the most dangerous, requiring the highest level of spiritual discipline and moral integrity to use safely. those who sought to access these powers without proper preparation or with malicious intent risked becoming permanently altered by forces beyond their control or understanding. The early tribal spiritual practices that emerged from these foundational teachings included elaborate systems of ceremony and ritual designed to maintain proper relationship with the holy people and to protect against spiritual corruption. These practices recognized that the ability to transform physically and spiritually was an inherent part of human nature, but that such abilities required careful cultivation and strict ethical guidelines to prevent their misuse. Traditional healing ceremonies incorporated elements of spiritual transformation, allowing medicine people to temporarily adopt certain animal characteristics or to access spiritual realms normally beyond human reach. However, these transformations were always conducted within carefully defined ceremonial contexts, with specific prayers, songs, and ritual protections in place to ensure that the practitioner remained connected to positive spiritual forces and could return safely to normal human consciousness. The concept of spiritual transformation, as understood in traditional Diné practice, was fundamentally different from the corrupted version that would later be associated with Skinwalkers. Legitimate spiritual transformation was always temporary, always conducted for the benefit of the community, and always performed with the guidance and protection of the holy people. It required years of training, spiritual purification, and the development of strong moral character. Most importantly, it was always reversible, allowing the practitioner to return to their normal state without permanent alteration to their essential nature. The corruption of sacred knowledge among the Diné people represented one of the most profound spiritual transgressions imaginable within their cosmological framework. The Hataliai, or traditional medicine people, occupied positions of extraordinary responsibility and power within their communities, serving as intermediaries between the human world and the realm of the holy people. These individuals underwent decades of rigorous training, memorizing thousands of songs, prayers, and ceremonial procedures, while developing the spiritual discipline necessary to safely navigate the dangerous territories between worlds. However, the very knowledge that made them capable of healing and spiritual guidance also contained within it the potential for devastating corruption. The path to becoming a Hatali required an individual to master complex ceremonial systems that had been passed down through generations of spiritual practitioners. Each ceremony represented a complete universe of knowledge, incorporating specific songs that could number in the hundreds, intricate sand paintings that required perfect execution, and ritual procedures that demanded absolute precision. The Blessing Way ceremony alone contained over 500 songs, while the more complex healing ceremonies like the Night Way or the Mountain Way could take 9 days to complete and require the practitioner to maintain perfect spiritual focus throughout the entire process. Within this vast repository of sacred knowledge lay certain elements that were considered particularly dangerous. The Hataliai learned not only how to invoke the protection and healing power of the holy people, but also how to recognize and combat malevolent spiritual forces. This defensive knowledge necessarily included detailed information about the nature of spiritual corruption, the methods by which harmful entities operated, and the specific weaknesses that could be exploited by those who chose to abandon the path of harmony. The transformation from healer to Skinwalker did not occur suddenly, but represented a gradual process of spiritual deterioration that could unfold over months or even years. The initial stages often began with subtle violations of ceremonial protocol or the misuse of sacred knowledge for personal gain. A Hataliai might begin charging excessive fees for healing ceremonies, or might use their spiritual authority to manipulate community members for personal advantage. These seemingly minor transgressions created spiritual imbalances that, if left uncorrected, could eventually lead to more serious violations of sacred law. The most dangerous aspect of this corruption process involved the deliberate inversion of healing practices. Traditional Diné ceremonies were designed to restore harmony and balance, bringing individuals and communities back into proper relationship with the natural and supernatural worlds. However, the same ceremonial knowledge could theoretically be perverted to achieve the opposite effect. A corrupted medicine person might begin using healing songs in reverse, or might deliberately contaminate sacred objects with spiritually polluting substances. These practices created what traditional teachings described as spiritual poison, which gradually transformed the practitioner's essential nature. The specific taboos that governed traditional spiritual practice served as protective barriers against such corruption. These prohibitions were not arbitrary rules, but represented fundamental spiritual laws that maintained the integrity of the connection between human practitioners and the holy people. Among the most serious of these taboos was the prohibition against contact with the dead and the materials associated with death. Traditional Diné belief held that death created a powerful spiritual contamination that could only be properly managed through specific purification ceremonies conducted by specialists trained in dealing with such dangerous forces. The violation of death-related taboos represented one of the most direct paths towards Skinwalker transformation. A Hatalii who deliberately sought contact with corpses or who used materials taken from the dead in their ceremonies was believed to invite spiritual corruption of the most dangerous kind. This corruption was not merely symbolic, but was understood to create actual changes in the individual's spiritual composition. The life force that normally animated a medicine person and connected them to the holy people became contaminated with the spiritual residue of death, gradually transforming their nature from that of a healer to that of a predator. Corpse poison, known in traditional terminology as the spiritual contamination that emanated from dead bodies, played a central role in Skinwalker transformation mythology. This substance was not understood as a physical poison, but as a spiritual force that could fundamentally alter the nature of anyone who came into deliberate contact with it. Traditional teachings held that the spirits of the dead retained certain connections to their physical remains, and that these connections could be exploited by those who possessed the knowledge and the moral corruption necessary to do so. The process of acquiring corpse poison required a medicine person to violate multiple layers of spiritual protection. First, they had to overcome their natural spiritual defenses, which had been strengthened through years of ceremonial practice and connection to the holy people. This often involved the deliberate performance of ceremonies designed to sever their connection to positive spiritual forces. Second, they had to physically approach and handle the remains of the dead, exposing themselves to the full force of death-related spiritual contamination. Finally, they had to incorporate this contaminated material into their spiritual practice, using it as a component in perverted ceremonies designed to grant them the power to harm rather than heal. The desecration of the dead took many forms within the context of Skinwalker transformation. Some corrupted medicine people were believed to rob graves, taking bones, hair, or other physical remains to use in their dark ceremonies. Others might deliberately contaminate burial sites, mixing grave dirt with sacred ceremonial materials to create spiritually poisonous substances. The most extreme forms of desecration involved the actual consumption of materials taken from corpses, a practice that was believed to complete the transformation process by introducing death directly into the practitioner's physical body. These practices were understood to fundamentally alter the spiritual composition of the individual involved. Traditional Diné cosmology held that every person possessed multiple spiritual components, including various forms of life force, that connected them to different aspects of the natural and supernatural worlds. The deliberate introduction of death-related contamination was believed to corrupt these spiritual components, gradually replacing the life-giving connections that linked the individual to the holy people with death-oriented forces that aligned them with malevolent entities. The role of forbidden ceremonial knowledge in Skinwalker transformation extended beyond simple rule-breaking to encompass the deliberate perversion of sacred wisdom. A Hatali who chose the path of corruption did not simply abandon their ceremonial knowledge, but actively inverted it, using their understanding of spiritual mechanics to achieve harmful rather than beneficial effects. This process required an intimate familiarity with the deepest levels of ceremonial practice, as only someone who truly understood how spiritual forces operated could successfully manipulate them for destructive purposes. The transformation of ceremonial materials represented another crucial aspect of the corruption process. Sacred objects that had been consecrated for healing ceremonies could be deliberately contaminated with spiritually polluting substances, transforming them into tools of harm rather than instruments of restoration. Prayer bundles might be stuffed with grave dirt instead of sacred herbs, or ceremonial masks might be painted with pigments mixed with corpse powder. These perverted objects retained their spiritual potency, but channeled that power toward destructive rather than constructive ends. The concept of spiritual corruption as understood within traditional Diné thought involved more than simple moral degradation. It represented an actual transformation of the individual's essential nature, a fundamental alteration that affected not only their spiritual composition, but also their physical capabilities and psychological orientation. This transformation was believed to be largely irreversible, as the corrupted individual had severed their connections to the holy people who might otherwise have provided guidance back to the path of harmony. The psychological aspects of Skinwalker transformation involved the gradual development of predatory instincts and the loss of normal human empathy. As the corruption process advanced, the affected individual was believed to become increasingly detached from human emotional connections, viewing other people primarily as potential sources of power or objects to be manipulated. This psychological transformation paralleled the spiritual changes, creating an individual who retained human intelligence and knowledge, but had lost the moral restraints that normally governed human behavior. The physical aspects of the transformation were equally profound. Traditional teachings held that the spiritual corruption gradually affected the individual's physical body, granting them abilities that normal humans did not possess while simultaneously making them vulnerable to certain spiritual attacks. The ability to change shape, to move with supernatural speed, and to influence the behavior of animals were all understood to be consequences of the fundamental alteration in the person's spiritual nature. The process by which a corrupted medicine person learned to assume animal forms involved the deliberate violation of the spiritual boundaries that normally separated human consciousness from animal consciousness. Traditional ceremonies sometimes required practitioners to temporarily adopt certain animal characteristics for healing purposes, but these transformations were always conducted within carefully controlled spiritual environments and were designed to be temporary and reversible. Skinwalker transformation involved the permanent breaking down of these boundaries, allowing the corrupted individual to access animal forms at will, but at the cost of their essential humanity. The selection of animal forms was not random but reflected specific aspects of the corruption process, and the particular spiritual forces that the Skinwalker had aligned themselves with. Predatory animals like wolves, coyotes, and bears were most commonly associated with Skinwalker activity because their natural characteristics aligned with the predatory nature that the corrupted individual had developed. However, other animals might be chosen based on their particular abilities or their symbolic significance within the context of the Skinwalker's intended activities. The maintenance of Skinwalker powers required ongoing spiritual corruption and the continued violation of sacred taboos. Unlike legitimate spiritual abilities, which were sustained through proper ceremonial practice and connection to positive spiritual forces, Skinwalker powers demanded constant reinforcement through harmful acts. This created a cycle of escalating corruption, as the individual was forced to commit increasingly serious spiritual transgressions in order to maintain their transformed abilities. The actual process of physical transformation represented the most terrifying aspect of Skinwalker mythology, as traditional accounts described metamorphoses that violated every natural law governing the relationship between human and animal consciousness. According to oral histories passed down through generations of Diné storytellers, the corrupted medicine person who had completed their spiritual degradation gained the ability to shed their human form like a discarded garment, adopting the physical characteristics and capabilities of various animals while retaining their human intelligence and malevolent intent. The wolf form stood as perhaps the most feared manifestation of Skinwalker transformation within traditional accounts. Wolves possessed natural characteristics that aligned perfectly with the predatory nature that corrupted medicine people had developed through their spiritual degradation. The transformation into wolf form was described as beginning with a violent convulsion that seized the Skinwalker's entire body, causing their human flesh to ripple and shift as bones lengthened and muscles reformed themselves according to lupine anatomy. Witnesses who claimed to have observed such transformations reported that the process appeared excruciatingly painful, with the changing individual emitting sounds that combined human screams with animal howls in ways that violated the natural order of both species. The wolf-form Skinwalker retained human-level intelligence while gaining access to enhanced sensory capabilities that far exceeded normal human limitations. Their sense of smell became so acute that they could track individual humans across vast distances, following scent trails that were days or even weeks old. Their hearing expanded to encompass frequencies beyond human perception, allowing them to detect conversations and activities occurring miles away. Most disturbing of all, their vision adapted to function perfectly in complete darkness, giving them a significant advantage over potential victims who remained bound by normal human sensory limitations. The physical capabilities of wolf-form skinwalkers were described in traditional accounts as surpassing those of natural wolves by significant margins. They could run at speeds that allowed them to keep pace with galloping horses across rough terrain, maintaining this pace for hours without showing signs of exhaustion. Their strength increased to levels that enabled them to tear through wooden doors and stone walls, while their agility allowed them to scale cliff faces and navigate treacherous terrain that would challenge even experienced mountaineers. The combination of supernatural physical abilities with retained human intelligence made wolf-form skinwalkers particularly dangerous adversaries. Coyote transformation represented another commonly reported manifestation of skinwalker abilities, though the characteristics associated with this form differed significantly from those of the wolf. Coyotes held special significance within Diné cosmology as trickster figures, beings whose intelligence and adaptability often led them into situations where they served as both creators and destroyers of order. The skinwalker who adopted coyote form gained access to supernatural cunning that went far beyond normal animal intelligence, developing an almost preternatural ability to anticipate and counter the actions of their intended victims. The physical transformation into coyote form was described as more fluid and less violent than wolf transformation, with the skinwalker's body seeming to flow and reshape itself rather than undergoing the dramatic convulsions associated with other animal forms. The resulting creature retained the lean, efficient build of a natural coyote, but possessed eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence and malevolence that immediately marked it as something other than a normal animal. Traditional accounts emphasize that the coyote-form skinwalkers were nearly impossible to track or trap, as their enhanced cunning allowed them to anticipate and avoid most attempts at capture or confrontation. The supernatural abilities attributed to coyote-form skinwalkers included an enhanced capacity for deception that went far beyond simple physical disguise. These entities were believed capable of manipulating their surroundings in subtle ways that confused and misdirected their victims, causing people to become lost in familiar territory or to perceive dangers where none existed. They could mimic the voices of trusted family members with perfect accuracy, luring victims away from safety by calling to them in the darkness using the voices of loved ones. Bear transformation represented perhaps the most physically powerful manifestation of Skinwalker abilities, though it was also considered one of the most spiritually corrupting forms to adopt. Bears held complex significance within traditional Diné belief systems, serving as symbols of both protective strength and dangerous unpredictability. The Skinwalker who chose to adopt bear form underwent a transformation that was described as fundamentally altering their relationship with the physical world, granting them strength that surpassed that of natural bears while corrupting their spiritual essence in ways that made return to human form increasingly difficult. The process of bear transformation was reported to be the most physically traumatic of all Skinwalker metamorphoses, as the human skeletal structure had to undergo massive changes to accommodate the bear's powerful build. Traditional accounts describe the sound of bones cracking and reforming as clearly audible during the transformation process, accompanied by the tearing and stretching of muscles and skin as they adapted to support the bear's massive frame. The completed transformation resulted in a creature that retained human intelligence, while possessing the raw physical power to tear apart wooden structures and overpower multiple human opponents simultaneously. Bear-form Skinwalkers were attributed with supernatural durability that made them extremely difficult to injure or kill through conventional means. Traditional weapons like arrows and spears were described as having minimal effect against their thick hide and dense muscle mass, while their enhanced healing abilities allowed them to recover from wounds that would prove fatal to normal animals or humans. This combination of massive strength and supernatural resilience made bear-form Skinwalkers particularly feared adversaries in traditional accounts. The mountain lion form represented another significant manifestation of Skinwalker transformation, though accounts of this particular metamorphosis were less common than those involving wolves, coyotes, or bears. Mountain lions were respected within traditional Diné culture as skilled hunters whose stealth and patience made them formidable predators, qualities that translated into particularly dangerous characteristics when adopted by corrupted medicine people. The Skinwalker who assumed mountain lion form gained access to supernatural stealth abilities that allowed them to move through even familiar territory without being detected by those who knew the area intimately. The transformation into mountain lion form was described as creating a creature whose movements defied normal physical laws, allowing it to traverse rocky terrain without disturbing loose stones or to pass through dense vegetation without creating any sound or disturbance. Traditional accounts emphasize that mountain lion form Skinwalkers could remain motionless for hours at a time while observing their intended victims, displaying a patience that combined feline hunting instincts with human intelligence to create an almost perfect predator. Bird forms, particularly those of ravens and owls, represented a different category of Skinwalker transformation that emphasized supernatural mobility and the ability to observe potential victims from great distances. The transformation into bird form was described as perhaps the most disorienting of all Skinwalker metamorphoses, as it required the complete restructuring of the skeletal system to accommodate hollow bones and wing structures while maintaining the enlarged brain necessary to retain human intelligence. Raven-form Skinwalkers were attributed with the ability to fly at supernatural speeds across vast distances, allowing them to gather information about potential victims and to coordinate attacks across wide geographical areas. Traditional accounts describe these entities as possessing an almost omniscient awareness of activities occurring within their territory, as their aerial perspective and enhanced vision allowed them to observe events that would remain hidden from ground-based observers. Owl transformation carried particular significance within Skinwalker mythology due to the complex relationship between owls and death within traditional Diné belief systems. Owls were generally viewed as harbingers of death and misfortune, making the Skinwalker who adopted owl form particularly feared and avoided. The supernatural abilities associated with owl form transformation included enhanced night vision that allowed perfect sight in complete darkness and silent flight that enabled the creature to approach victims without any warning of its presence. The process of transformation itself, regardless of the specific animal form being adopted, was described in traditional accounts as involving far more than simple physical metamorphosis. The Skinwalker's consciousness had to merge temporarily with that of the chosen animal, accessing instinctual knowledge and behavioural patterns while maintaining human intelligence and malevolent intent. This merger was believed to be spiritually corrupting for the Skinwalker, as each transformation further eroded their essential humanity while strengthening their connection to predatory spiritual forces. Traditional accounts emphasized that the transformation process required the use of specific ritual objects and procedures that had been corrupted from their original healing purposes. Animal skins played a central role in many transformation rituals, but these were not ordinary pelts. Instead, they were skins that had been prepared through spiritually corrupting processes, often involving the deliberate violation of traditional hunting protocols and the contamination of the preparation process, with materials associated with death and spiritual pollution. The Skinwalker would don these corrupted animal skins while performing inverted versions of traditional ceremonies, using songs and prayers that had been deliberately reversed or contaminated to achieve harmful rather than beneficial effects. The combination of spiritually polluted ritual materials with perverted ceremonial procedures was believed to create the spiritual conditions necessary for the physical transformation to occur. The supernatural speed attributed to transformed skinwalkers represented one of their most consistently reported abilities across different animal forms. Traditional accounts describe these entities as capable of covering distances that would require hours of normal travel in a matter of minutes, moving across rough terrain with an efficiency that defied normal physical limitations. This enhanced speed was not simply a matter of improved physical conditioning, but was understood to result from the skinwalkers' altered relationship with the physical world, allowing them to move in ways that partially transcended normal spatial constraints. The strength enhancements associated with skinwalker transformation varied according to the specific animal form being adopted, but all transformed skinwalkers were described as possessing physical power that far exceeded that of normal humans, or even normal animals of the same species. Wolf-form skinwalkers could tear through wooden barriers and overpower multiple human opponents, while bear-form entities possessed strength sufficient to demolish stone structures and uproot large trees. This supernatural strength was accompanied by enhanced durability that made skinwalkers extremely difficult to injure through conventional means. Perhaps the most disturbing ability attributed to transformed skinwalkers was their capacity to perfectly mimic human voices, using this skill to deceive and lure potential victims. Traditional accounts described skinwalkers calling to people in the darkness, using the voices of trusted family members, friends or community leaders, often incorporating specific speech patterns and personal information that made the deception nearly impossible to detect. This vocal mimicry was not limited to human voices, but extended to the ability to reproduce the sounds of various animals and natural phenomena, allowing skinwalkers to create auditory illusions that confused and misdirected their intended victims. The psychological toll exacted by the transformation process was described in traditional teachings as gradually eroding the skinwalker's capacity for normal human emotion and connection. Each transformation was believed to strengthen the individual's connection to predatory spiritual forces while weakening their ties to human community and empathy. Over time, the repeated adoption of animal forms was said to make it increasingly difficult for the skinwalker to maintain their human identity, as the predatory instincts and behavioural patterns of their chosen animal forms began to dominate their psychological makeup, even when they had returned to human shape. The spiritual consequences of transformation extended beyond the individual skinwalker to affect their relationships with both the human and supernatural worlds. Traditional teachings held that the holy people withdrew their protection and guidance from those who had chosen the path of corruption, leaving them vulnerable to malevolent spiritual forces that sought to exploit and further corrupt their already compromised spiritual state. This spiritual isolation was believed to accelerate the degradation process, as the Skinwalker lost access to the positive spiritual influences that might otherwise have provided opportunities for redemption and return to harmony. The physical process of returning to human form after animal transformation was described as equally traumatic as the initial metamorphosis, involving the reversal of all the anatomical changes that had occurred during the shift to animal form. Traditional accounts suggested that this reverse transformation became increasingly difficult and painful as the Skinwalkers' spiritual corruption advanced, with some individuals eventually becoming trapped in animal form as their human identity became too degraded to reassert itself over their adopted animal nature. The supernatural abilities attributed to Skinwalkers extended far beyond their capacity for physical transformation, encompassing a vast array of powers that fundamentally violated the natural order and placed these corrupted beings in direct opposition to the harmonious balance that governed traditional Diné spiritual understanding. These abilities represented the complete inversion of the healing and protective powers that legitimate medicine people used to benefit their communities, transformed through spiritual corruption into tools of manipulation, harm, and terror that could affect individuals, families, and entire communities across vast distances and extended periods of time. The enhanced sensory capabilities of Skinwalkers constituted perhaps their most immediately practical supernatural advantage, allowing them to gather information and track their intended victims with an efficiency that surpassed even the most skilled traditional hunters and trackers. Their sense of smell was described in traditional accounts as being so acute that they could detect the unique scent signature of specific individuals from distances of several miles, even when that scent had been obscured by rain, snow, or the passage of considerable time. This olfactory enhancement allowed Skinwalkers to track their targets across diverse terrain and through changing weather conditions, following scent trails that would be completely imperceptible to normal human senses. The visual capabilities attributed to Skinwalkers included not only perfect night vision that allowed them to operate effectively in complete darkness, but also the ability to perceive spiritual emanations and energy patterns that remained invisible to ordinary sight. Traditional teachings described Skinwalkers as being able to see the spiritual connections that linked individuals to their families, communities, and protective ceremonies, allowing them to identify the most vulnerable points in their intended victims' spiritual defenses. This enhanced vision also enabled them to detect the presence of protective objects, blessed areas, and spiritual barriers that might otherwise provide safety against their attacks. Their auditory abilities were said to extend across both normal and supernatural spectrums, allowing Skinwalkers to hear conversations occurring at great distances and to detect the spiritual vibrations created by ceremonial activities, prayers, and other religious practices. This supernatural hearing provided them with advance warning of attempts to organize protection against them, while also allowing them to gather detailed information about their intended victims' daily routines, family relationships, and spiritual practices. Traditional accounts described Skinwalkers as being able to distinguish between different individuals based solely on the sound of their breathing or heartbeat, even when those sounds were masked by other environmental noise. The ability to influence others through spiritual means represented one of the most feared aspects of Skinwalker power, as it allowed these corrupted beings to affect their victims without direct physical contact or even proximity. This influence was understood to operate through the manipulation of spiritual connections that linked all living beings within the traditional Diné cosmological framework. By corrupting these natural spiritual bonds, Skinwalkers could project their malevolent intent across vast distances, causing psychological disturbance, physical illness, and spiritual confusion in their chosen targets. The process of spiritual manipulation began with the Skinwalker identifying and accessing the spiritual signature of their intended victim, often accomplished through the acquisition of personal items, hair, nail clippings, or other materials that retained a connection to the target's spiritual essence. Once this connection was established, the Skinwalker could begin projecting harmful spiritual influences that would gradually affect the victim's mental state, physical health, and spiritual balance. Traditional accounts describe this process as creating a kind of spiritual poison that slowly corrupted the victim's natural defences and left them increasingly vulnerable to more direct forms of attack. The psychological effects of Skinwalker spiritual manipulation were described as beginning subtly, with victims experiencing unexplained feelings of anxiety, depression, or paranoia that seemed to have no identifiable cause. As the spiritual attack intensified, these psychological symptoms would escalate into more severe manifestations, including vivid nightmares, hallucinations, and episodes of dissociation that could last for hours or even days. Victims might find themselves unable to sleep, plagued by the sensation that they were being constantly watched or followed, even when they were alone in familiar and previously comfortable environments. The physical manifestations of Skinwalker spiritual attacks included a wide range of symptoms that traditional healers recognized as distinct from ordinary illness or injury. Victims might develop chronic fatigue that could not be relieved by rest, persistent headaches that resisted all conventional treatment, or mysterious rashes and skin conditions that appeared without apparent cause. More severe cases involved the gradual wasting away of the victim's physical strength and vitality, as the Skinwalker's spiritual attacks slowly drained their life force and disrupted their body's natural healing processes. The ability to cause harm to entire families through spiritual manipulation represented an escalation of Skinwalker power that could affect multiple generations and create lasting damage to community social structures. Traditional teachings described Skinwalkers as being capable of targeting the spiritual connections that bound families together, introducing discord, suspicion, and conflict where harmony had previously existed. This family-targeted spiritual attack might manifest as sudden outbreaks of serious illness affecting multiple family members, unexplained accidents or injuries that seem to follow a pattern of escalating severity, or the development of psychological problems that spread through family relationships like a contagious disease. The breaking of traditional protections constituted one of the most sophisticated aspects of Skinwalker spiritual power, as it required intimate knowledge of the ceremonial systems and spiritual protocols that normally provided safety against supernatural threats. Skinwalkers were believed capable of neutralizing protective ceremonies, contaminating sacred objects, and corrupting blessed spaces through the deliberate application of spiritually polluting influences. This ability made them particularly dangerous opponents, as they could systematically dismantle the spiritual defenses that communities relied upon for protection against supernatural threats. The process of breaking protective ceremonies involved the Skinwalker identifying the specific spiritual mechanics that powered the protection and then introducing corrupting influences that would neutralize or reverse the ceremony's beneficial effects. A protective blessing that had been placed on a home might be corrupted through the strategic placement of spiritually contaminated objects near the blessed area, gradually weakening the protection until it became ineffective. Sacred objects like prayer bundles or ceremonial tools could be corrupted through spiritual contamination that was projected from a distance, transforming protective items into sources of spiritual pollution that actually increased the victim's vulnerability to supernatural attack. The corruption of sacred spaces represented another aspect of Skinwalker power that could have devastating effects on entire communities. Traditional gathering places, ceremonial grounds, and other locations that had been blessed through generations of proper spiritual practice could be systematically contaminated through the application of spiritually polluting influences. Once corrupted, these spaces would no longer provide their traditional protective benefits and might actually become sources of spiritual danger that affected anyone who visited them. The ability to control and inhabit animal forms as extensions of their corrupted spiritual power allowed skinwalkers to project their influence across vast geographical areas, while maintaining the ability to observe and manipulate events from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Unlike their personal transformation into animal form, this power involved the spiritual possession or control of normal animals, turning them into extensions of the skinwalker's consciousness and will. Traditional accounts described skinwalkers as being capable of simultaneously controlling dozens of different animals across wide territories, creating networks of observation and influence that made it extremely difficult for potential victims to avoid their attention. The animals under skinwalker control retained their normal physical appearance and basic behavioural patterns, making them difficult to identify as supernatural threats. However, these controlled creatures exhibited subtle behavioural anomalies that experienced observers could learn to recognise. They might display unusual fearlessness around humans, appear in locations where they would not normally be found, or exhibit coordinated behaviour patterns that suggested intelligence beyond normal animal capabilities. Traditional teachings emphasized the importance of paying attention to these behavioral signs, as they often provided the only warning of skinwalker activity in an area. The spiritual mechanics of animal control involved the skinwalker projecting a portion of their consciousness into the target animal, temporarily overriding the creature's natural instincts and behavioral patterns while maintaining their own awareness and decision-making capabilities. This process was described as requiring significant spiritual energy and concentration, limiting the number of animals that could be controlled simultaneously and the duration for which such control could be maintained. However, experienced skinwalkers were believed capable of maintaining control over multiple animals for extended periods, creating persistent surveillance networks that could monitor potential victims continuously. The controlled animals served multiple functions within the skinwalker's supernatural operations. They could gather information about potential victims' daily routines, family relationships, and spiritual practices, providing detailed intelligence that would be difficult to obtain through direct observation. They could also serve as instruments of psychological warfare, appearing at strategic moments to create fear and uncertainty while avoiding direct confrontation that might reveal the skinwalker's involvement. In some cases, controlled animals were used to deliver spiritually contaminated materials to targeted locations, spreading spiritual pollution without requiring the skinwalker to risk direct exposure. The connection between skinwalkers and spiritual imbalance extended beyond their personal corruption to encompass their role as active agents of chaos within the broader spiritual ecosystem that governed traditional Diné cosmology. Their very existence represented a fundamental violation of the natural order, creating disturbances that rippled outward to affect the spiritual balance of entire regions. Traditional teachings described skinwalkers as spiritual parasites that fed on the harmony and positive energy of their surroundings, gradually corrupting the spiritual environment in ways that made it increasingly difficult for legitimate spiritual practices to function effectively. The disruption of harmony between natural and supernatural worlds constituted perhaps the most far-reaching aspect of skinwalker influence, as their activities created imbalances that could persist for generations and affect the spiritual well-being of entire communities. The natural world operated according to spiritual principles that emphasize balance, reciprocity, and mutual support between all living beings. Skinwalkers violated these principles through their predatory behavior and their deliberate corruption of spiritual connections, creating areas of spiritual disturbance that affected both human communities and the natural environment. The environmental effects of Skinwalker activity were described in traditional accounts as creating zones of spiritual pollution where normal animals avoided travelling, plants failed to grow properly, and water sources became contaminated with negative spiritual influences. These corrupted areas could persist long after the Skinwalker had moved on, continuing to affect anyone who entered them, and serving as sources of ongoing spiritual disturbance that gradually spread to surrounding regions. The disruption of seasonal cycles and natural phenomena represented another manifestation of Skinwalker influence on the spiritual balance of their environment. Traditional Diné understanding held that the proper timing of seasonal changes, weather patterns, and natural cycles depended on the maintenance of spiritual harmony between human communities and the natural world. Skinwalker activity could disrupt these delicate spiritual relationships, causing unusual weather patterns, unseasonable changes in animal behaviour, and other environmental anomalies that affected entire ecosystems. The ability to manipulate dreams and sleep represented a particularly insidious aspect of Skinwalker power that allowed them to attack their victims during their most vulnerable periods. Traditional teachings describe sleep as a time when the spiritual defences were naturally lowered, making individuals more susceptible to supernatural influence and attack. Skinwalkers could exploit this vulnerability by projecting their consciousness into their victims' dreams, creating terrifying experiences that served both to weaken the victim's spiritual defenses and to gather information about their fears, relationships, and spiritual practices. Dream manipulation involved the Skinwalker accessing the victim's sleeping consciousness and introducing foreign elements that transformed normal dreams into nightmarish experiences. These manipulated dreams were described as having a quality of hyperreality that made them more vivid and memorable than normal dreams, often featuring scenarios that seemed to predict future events or reveal hidden information about the victim's life. The psychological impact of these dream attacks could be devastating, as victims found themselves afraid to sleep and gradually became physically and mentally exhausted from the constant spiritual assault. The ability to influence weather patterns and natural phenomena represented an advanced manifestation of Skinwalker power that demonstrated their capacity to disrupt the spiritual mechanisms governing the natural world. Traditional accounts describe Skinwalkers as being capable of summoning unseasonable storms, creating areas of persistent drought or excessive moisture, and manipulating wind patterns to serve their purposes. These weather control abilities were understood to result from the Skinwalkers' corrupted relationship with the spiritual forces that normally maintained natural balance and harmony. The spiritual pollution created by Skinwalker activities extended beyond immediate effects on their victims to encompass long-term contamination of the spiritual environment that could affect future generations. Areas where Skinwalkers had been active were described as retaining traces of spiritual corruption that could influence the spiritual development of children born in those regions, making them more susceptible to negative influences and less capable of maintaining proper spiritual balance. This generational effect meant that Skinwalker activity could have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate victims to affect entire family lines and community spiritual traditions. The darkness held special significance for Skinwalkers, not merely as cover for their activities, but as a spiritual realm where their corrupted powers reached their fullest expression. Traditional Diné understanding recognized the night as a time when the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds became more permeable, allowing supernatural entities to move more freely between dimensions and exercise abilities that remained dormant during daylight hours. For Skinwalkers, this nocturnal enhancement of spiritual activity provided the optimal conditions for hunting human prey, as their victims' natural defences were weakened by sleep, while their own supernatural capabilities were strengthened by the spiritual forces that governed the hours of darkness. The preference for nighttime activity among Skinwalkers stemmed from multiple factors that combined to create hunting conditions far superior to those available during daylight. The physical darkness provided obvious tactical advantages, allowing these shape-shifted predators to approach their intended victims without being easily detected or identified. However, the spiritual aspects of nighttime activity proved even more significant, as traditional teachings held that the protective influence of certain holy people diminished after sunset, while malevolent spiritual forces gained increased power to influence events in the physical world. The hours between midnight and dawn represented the peak period of Skinwalker activity, when their supernatural abilities reached maximum effectiveness and their victims were most vulnerable to spiritual attack. During these deepest hours of night, the spiritual barriers that normally protected human consciousness became naturally weakened, allowing Skinwalkers to project their malevolent influence more effectively and to access their victims' dreams and subconscious minds with greater ease. Traditional accounts consistently described Skinwalker encounters as occurring during this period, when even the most spiritually protected individuals found their defenses challenged by the concentrated negative forces that these corrupted beings could bring to bear. The selection of isolated victims represented a calculated strategy that reflected both practical considerations and the spiritual mechanics governing Skinwalker predation. Individuals who were separated from their communities, whether by physical distance or social circumstances, lacked the protective spiritual connections that came from being surrounded by family members and community supporters. Traditional Diné spiritual understanding emphasized the collective nature of spiritual protection, recognizing that individuals drew strength from their connections to others, and that isolation made people vulnerable to supernatural attack in ways that went far beyond simple physical security concerns. Travelers moving alone across the vast landscapes of the Southwest became particularly attractive targets for Skinwalker predation, as their distance from home communities severed many of the spiritual connections that normally provided protection against supernatural threats. These solitary travelers often carried valuable trade goods or possessed specialized knowledge that made them worthwhile targets, while their isolation ensured that any attack could be carried out without immediate interference from protective family members or community defenders. The psychological state of lone travelers, often anxious about the dangers of their journey and separated from familiar spiritual anchors, created additional vulnerabilities that experienced Skinwalkers learned to exploit. Herders and hunters who spent extended periods alone in remote areas represented another category of preferred victims, as their occupations required them to venture far from the protective influence of their home communities while focusing their attention on tasks that left them less alert to supernatural threats. The spiritual isolation experienced by these individuals during their solitary work periods created opportunities for Skinwalkers to observe their routines, identify their vulnerabilities, and plan attacks that could be executed with minimal risk of discovery or retaliation. The targeting of individuals who were already experiencing spiritual or emotional distress reflected the sophisticated understanding that Skinwalkers possessed regarding human psychological vulnerabilities. People who were grieving the loss of family members, struggling with serious illness, or dealing with major life transitions existed in states of spiritual imbalance that made them more susceptible to supernatural influence and attack. Traditional teachings recognized these periods of personal crisis as times when individuals required additional spiritual protection and community support, understanding that emotional and spiritual disturbance created openings that malevolent entities could exploit. The approach methods employed by Skinwalkers demonstrated their intimate knowledge of human psychology and their ability to exploit the deepest fears and attachments that governed human behavior. Rather than relying solely on physical intimidation or brute force, these corrupted beings employed sophisticated deception techniques that played on their victims' emotional connections and trust relationships. The ability to perfectly mimic familiar voices allowed Skinwalkers to impersonate trusted family members, calling to their intended victims in the darkness using the speech patterns and personal information that would make the deception virtually impossible to detect. The mimicry of children's voices represented one of the most emotionally manipulative tactics employed by skinwalkers, as it exploited the powerful protective instincts that adults felt towards young family members. Traditional accounts described skinwalkers calling out in the darkness using the voices of children who were supposedly lost, injured or in danger, compelling potential victims to leave the safety of their homes or camps to provide assistance. The emotional urgency created by the apparent distress of a child often overrode normal caution and spiritual awareness, leading victims to venture into dangerous situations where they became vulnerable to attack. The imitation of elderly or respected community members provided another avenue for deception that exploited the cultural values of respect and obedience that govern traditional Diné social relationships. A skinwalker might approach a potential victim using the voice and mannerisms of a revered elder or medicine person, issuing instructions or requests that the victim would feel culturally obligated to obey. This form of deception proved particularly effective against younger individuals who had been raised to show unquestioning respect for their elders and who might not immediately question unusual requests from apparent authority figures. The use of animal sounds and natural phenomena to create deceptive auditory environments represented a more subtle but equally effective approach technique. Skinwalkers could manipulate their vocal abilities to create the sounds of approaching storms, dangerous animals, or other natural threats that would cause potential victims to seek shelter or change their travel routes in ways that led them into areas where attack became more feasible. The creation of false animal distress calls could lure hunters or herders away from their companions, while the mimicry of bird songs or other natural sounds could mask the skinwalker's actual approach until it was too late for the victim to escape. The adoption of familiar human forms represented perhaps the most sophisticated deception technique available to skinwalkers, allowing them to approach their victims while appearing to be trusted friends, family members, or community figures. This form of impersonation required not only the physical ability to assume human appearance, but also detailed knowledge of the target individual's behavior patterns, speech habits, and personal relationships. Traditional accounts described skinwalkers spending weeks or months observing potential victims and their social circles, gathering the information necessary to create convincing impersonations that could withstand casual scrutiny. The spiritual corruption that motivated skinwalker malevolence operated on multiple levels that reflected both personal grievances and broader spiritual imbalances created by their transformation from healers to predators. Personal conflicts with specific individuals or families often provided the initial motivation for skinwalker attacks, as corrupted medicine people used their supernatural abilities to pursue vengeance against those they perceived as having wronged them. These personal vendettas could stem from professional disputes, romantic rejections, social slights, or conflicts over resources and territory that had escalated beyond normal community resolution mechanisms. The pursuit of forbidden power represented another significant motivation that drove skinwalker predation, as these corrupted beings required ongoing spiritual energy to maintain their supernatural abilities and prevent their complete dissolution into chaos. Traditional teachings described skinwalkers as spiritual parasites who fed on the life force and positive energy of their victims, gradually draining them of vitality while strengthening their own corrupted powers. This parasitic relationship created an ongoing need for new victims, as the energy gained from each attack was gradually consumed by the spiritual corruption that maintained the skinwalker's transformed state. The desire to spread spiritual corruption and create additional skinwalkers motivated some of the most dangerous and persistent forms of predatory behavior. Experienced skinwalkers understood that their own power could be increased by corrupting others and drawing them into the same spiritual degradation that they had undergone. This corruption process often began with subtle spiritual attacks designed to weaken the victim's connection to positive spiritual influences, gradually creating the psychological and spiritual conditions that might lead them to seek forbidden knowledge and power as a means of protecting themselves or gaining revenge against their attackers. The territorial aspects of Skinwalker motivation reflected their transformed relationship with the natural and spiritual landscapes they inhabited. Unlike legitimate medicine people who work to maintain harmony between human communities and the spiritual forces governing specific geographical areas, Skinwalkers sought to establish dominance over territories through the systematic corruption of spiritual connections and the elimination of competing sources of spiritual authority. This territorial behaviour could manifest as sustained campaigns against entire communities, with the Skinwalker working systematically to eliminate or corrupt local spiritual leaders while establishing themselves as the dominant supernatural force in the region. The spiritual vulnerability created by certain times and conditions provided Skinwalkers with optimal hunting opportunities that they learned to recognise and exploit with devastating effectiveness. The period immediately following the death of community members represented one of the most dangerous times for potential victims, as the spiritual disruption created by death weakened the protective barriers that normally shielded individuals from supernatural attack. Grieving family members were particularly vulnerable during this period, as their emotional distress and spiritual imbalance created openings that experienced Skinwalkers could exploit to establish initial contact and begin the process of spiritual manipulation. Seasonal transitions, particularly the periods surrounding the winter and summer solstices, created natural fluctuations in spiritual energy that affected the balance between positive and negative supernatural forces. Traditional Diné ceremonial cycles were designed to help communities navigate these transitional periods safely. But individuals who were isolated from proper ceremonial protection during these times became vulnerable to spiritual attack. Skinwalkers understood these seasonal patterns intimately and often timed their most significant attacks to coincide with periods when their intended victims' spiritual defences were naturally weakened. The occurrence of unusual natural phenomena such as eclipses, meteor showers, or unseasonable weather patterns created additional periods of spiritual vulnerability that Skinwalkers learned to exploit. Traditional teachings recognize these events as times when the normal spiritual order was temporarily disrupted, creating opportunities for malevolent forces to exercise increased influence over events in the physical world. Communities that maintained proper ceremonial practices could usually navigate these periods safely, but individuals who lacked adequate spiritual protection often found themselves targeted during these times of cosmic disturbance. Personal life transitions, including puberty, marriage, pregnancy, and old age, created natural periods of spiritual vulnerability that required special protection and ceremonial attention. Skinwalkers understood these transitional periods as times when individuals were naturally more open to spiritual influence, whether positive or negative, and often targeted people who were experiencing major life changes. The spiritual energy associated with these transitions could be corrupted and redirected toward harmful purposes, making it essential for communities to provide additional protection for individuals during these vulnerable periods. The connection between emotional distress and spiritual vulnerability provided Skinwalkers with opportunities to target individuals who were experiencing relationship conflicts, financial difficulties, or other sources of personal stress. Traditional understanding recognized that emotional imbalance created corresponding spiritual imbalances that could be exploited by malevolent entities seeking to establish influence over human victims. Skinwalkers often began their attacks by exacerbating existing sources of stress and conflict, gradually weakening their victims' spiritual defenses while creating the psychological conditions that would make them more susceptible to direct supernatural assault. The systematic approach employed by experienced Skinwalkers in selecting and pursuing their prey demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that combined predatory instincts with human intelligence in ways that made them formidable opponents for even well-protected communities. These corrupted beings often spent considerable time observing potential victims and their social environments, identifying patterns of behavior, sources of vulnerability, and optimal times for attack. This reconnaissance phase could extend for weeks or months, during which the Skinwalker would gradually gather the information necessary to plan and execute a successful assault while minimizing their own risk of discovery or retaliation. The psychological warfare tactics employed by Skinwalkers often preceded direct physical attacks by extended periods, during which the intended victim would experience escalating levels of supernatural harassment designed to weaken their resolve and isolate them from potential sources of help. This preliminary phase might involve the manipulation of dreams, the creation of disturbing omens and signs, and the gradual corruption of the victim's immediate environment through the strategic placement of spiritually contaminated objects or the influence of controlled animals. The recognition of Skinwalker presence required an intimate understanding of the subtle disruptions these corrupted beings created in the natural and spiritual order that govern traditional Diné territories. Unlike the obvious signs of physical danger that mark the approach of wild animals or hostile human enemies, Skinwalker activity manifested through disturbances that operated primarily in the spiritual realm before gradually affecting the physical world in ways that trained observers could learn to identify. These warning signs served as an early detection system for communities that maintained proper spiritual awareness, providing crucial advance notice that allowed for the implementation of protective measures before direct confrontation became unavoidable. The behavior of domestic animals provided one of the most reliable indicators of Skinwalker presence in the vicinity of human settlements. Dogs, horses, and sheep possessed natural sensitivity to supernatural disturbances that made them react strongly to the spiritual corruption that surrounded these malevolent entities. Traditional observers noted that dogs would begin displaying signs of extreme agitation hours or even days before any human became aware of Skinwalker activity, whimpering continuously, refusing to eat and showing reluctance to venture outside familiar areas, even when accompanied by their human companions. The animal's distress was not the typical fear response triggered by natural predators, but represented a deeper spiritual recognition of the fundamental wrongness that Skinwalkers brought to their environment. Horses demonstrated particularly dramatic reactions to Skinwalker proximity, often refusing to travel along routes they had previously navigated without difficulty, and showing signs of panic when forced to approach areas where Skinwalker activity had occurred. These animals would rear, buck, and attempt to flee even when no obvious threat was visible to their human handlers, displaying a level of terror that seemed disproportionate to any apparent danger. Traditional horsemen learned to trust these reactions as reliable warnings of supernatural threat, understanding that their mount's spiritual sensitivity provided advance notice of dangers that human senses could not yet detect. Sheep and goats exhibited their own distinctive patterns of distress when exposed to Skinwalker influence, huddling together in tight groups and refusing to graze in areas where they had previously fed without concern. The animals would remain motionless for hours, staring fixedly in the direction of the perceived threat while emitting low, continuous bleating sounds that differed markedly from their normal vocalizations. Experienced herders recognized these behavioral changes as clear indicators that supernatural danger threatened their flocks, often moving their animals to different grazing areas immediately upon observing such reactions. The disruption of normal animal behavior patterns extended beyond domestic species to encompass the wildlife that inhabited the traditional territories where Skinwalker activity occurred. Birds would abandon their normal roosting and feeding areas, often departing in large flocks that created unusual migration patterns outside their typical seasonal movements. The sudden absence of bird songs during periods when such vocalizations would normally be abundant provided another warning sign that experienced observers learned to recognize as indicating supernatural disturbance in the local spiritual environment. Small mammals, including rabbits, squirrels, and prairie dogs, would disappear from areas where skinwalker activity was occurring, abandoning burrows and feeding grounds that had supported their populations for generations. This exodus of small animals often preceded any human awareness of skinwalker presence by several days, creating an eerie silence in locations that had previously teemed with normal wildlife activity. Traditional hunters and gatherers who noticed such sudden changes in animal populations understood them as clear warnings to avoid those areas until the spiritual disturbance had passed. Predatory animals displayed particularly complex reactions to skinwalker presence that reflected their own position in the natural order and their sensitivity to the corrupted spiritual energy that these entities emanated. Wolves, coyotes, and mountain lions would often abandon their established territories when skinwalkers entered the area, recognizing at some instinctual level that these shape-shifting beings represented a perversion of their own natural characteristics. The departure of natural predators from their hunting grounds created observable changes in prey animal behavior that served as secondary indicators of skinwalker activity. The sounds associated with skinwalker presence created auditory disturbances that violated the natural acoustic patterns of the environments they inhabited. Traditional observers learned to distinguish between normal animal vocalizations and the unnatural sounds that accompanied skinwalker activity, recognizing subtle differences in tone, timing, and context that marked these vocalizations as supernatural in origin. The mimicry of familiar voices calling from impossible locations provided one of the most distinctive warning signs, as these calls would originate from areas where no human should logically be present, or would continue for extended periods without the natural variations that characterize genuine human speech. Animal sounds that occurred at inappropriate times or in wrong context served as additional auditory warnings of skinwalker presence. Wolves howling during daylight hours, owls calling during seasons when they should have migrated, or the sounds of large animals moving through areas where such creatures were not naturally present, all indicated potential supernatural activity. These unnatural vocalizations often displayed characteristics that careful listeners could identify as artificial, lacking the subtle variations and environmental responses that marked genuine animal communication. The creation of impossible acoustic phenomena provided another category of auditory warning signs that traditional observers learned to recognize. Sounds that appeared to originate from multiple locations simultaneously, voices that seemed to move through the air without any visible source, or conversations that could be heard clearly despite originating from distances that should have made them inaudible, all indicated the presence of supernatural entities capable of manipulating sound in ways that violated natural physical laws. Environmental disturbances created by skinwalker activity manifested in numerous ways that affected both the immediate physical surroundings and the broader spiritual ecosystem of affected areas. The corruption of water sources represented one of the most serious environmental indicators, as these vital resources would develop unpleasant tastes, odours, or appearances that made them unsuitable for human or animal consumption. Springs that had provided clean water for generations might suddenly become cloudy or develop metallic tastes that persisted despite the absence of any obvious contamination source. Plant life in areas affected by skinwalker activity would begin showing signs of distress that could not be attributed to normal environmental factors such as drought, disease, or insect damage. Healthy vegetation would wilt, change colour, or die without apparent cause, creating patches of dead or dying plant matter that stood out starkly against the surrounding healthy landscape. Traditional gatherers who noticed such unexplained plant deaths understood them as warnings to avoid harvesting food or medicinal plants from affected areas until the spiritual contamination had been properly addressed. The disruption of seasonal patterns provided another category of environmental warning signs that indicated skinwalker influence on the natural order. Flowers might bloom out of season, trees could lose their leaves during inappropriate times of year, or animals might display mating behaviours during periods when such activities would normally be dormant. These temporal disturbances reflected the Skinwalkers' corrupted relationship with the spiritual forces that governed natural cycles, creating observable anomalies that served as warnings to communities that maintained proper awareness of seasonal patterns. Weather disturbances associated with Skinwalker presence often manifested as localized phenomena that affected small areas while leaving surrounding regions unaffected. Sudden temperature drops, unseasonable storms, or persistent fog banks that formed without meteorological explanation could all indicate supernatural activity in specific locations. These weather anomalies typically displayed characteristics that distinguished them from natural phenomena, such as unusual duration, inappropriate timing, or patterns that seemed to focus on particular locations or follow specific individuals. The spiritual disturbances created by Skinwalker activity affected the invisible connections that linked human communities to the protective, spiritual forces that govern their territories. Traditional medicine people possessed the sensitivity necessary to detect these spiritual disruptions before they manifested in obvious physical signs, recognizing subtle changes in the spiritual atmosphere that indicated the presence of corrupted entities. These spiritual practitioners might experience difficulty conducting normal ceremonies, find that their prayers seem to lack their usual power, or sense the presence of malevolent forces that interfered with their connection to the holy people. Ceremonial objects and sacred spaces would begin showing signs of spiritual contamination when Skinwalker activity occurred in their vicinity. Prayer bundles might feel heavy or cold to the touch. Blessed items could develop unpleasant odours. Or sacred areas might create feelings of unease in individuals who had previously found comfort and spiritual strength in those locations. These changes in the spiritual quality of sacred objects and places provided clear warnings to traditional practitioners that supernatural threats were active in their area. Dreams and spiritual visions played a crucial role in the traditional warning system that alerted communities to Skinwalker threats, as these experiences provided access to spiritual information that was not available through normal physical senses. Traditional dreamers and visionaries possessed the ability to perceive supernatural dangers while they were still developing, receiving warnings through their sleep experiences that allowed communities to prepare protective measures before direct confrontation became necessary. These prophetic dreams often contained symbolic imagery that required interpretation by experienced spiritual practitioners who understood the traditional meanings associated with various dream elements. The content of warning dreams typically included images of corrupted animals, distorted human figures, or familiar landscapes that had been somehow altered or contaminated. Dreamers might see their own communities under attack by shape-shifting beings, witness the corruption of sacred places, or receive direct warnings from protective spiritual entities about impending supernatural threats. The emotional impact of these dreams was typically intense and memorable, distinguishing them from ordinary dream experiences and marking them as spiritually significant communications that required immediate attention. Recurring nightmares affecting multiple community members simultaneously provided another form of spiritual warning that indicated widespread Skinwalker influence in a particular area. When several individuals began experiencing similar disturbing dreams featuring shape-shifting predators, corrupted landscapes, or attacks on their families, traditional spiritual leaders recognized these shared experiences as collective warnings that required community-wide protective measures. The coordination of these dream experiences across multiple individuals indicated that the supernatural threat was sufficiently powerful to affect the spiritual environment of the entire community. Visions experienced during waking hours provided additional spiritual warnings that supplemented the information received through dream experiences. Traditional visionaries might perceive spiritual entities moving through the landscape, observe the corruption of natural features, or witness future events that revealed the Skinwalkers' intended targets and methods of attack. These waking visions typically occurred during periods of heightened spiritual awareness, such as during ceremonial activities, meditation, or times of personal spiritual crisis, when the individual's sensitivity to supernatural influences was naturally enhanced. The disruption of normal spiritual connections created observable effects that experienced practitioners could recognize as indicators of Skinwalker activity. Individuals who normally maintained strong spiritual awareness might find themselves feeling spiritually isolated or disconnected from their usual sources of guidance and protection. Prayers that had previously provided comfort and strength might seem empty or ineffective, while ceremonial activities could become difficult to perform or might produce unexpected results that indicated interference from malevolent spiritual forces. Traditional healing practices would begin showing reduced effectiveness when Skinwalker activity was affecting the spiritual environment of a community. Medicine people might find that their usual remedies failed to produce expected results, that their diagnostic abilities became unreliable, or that their patients showed resistance to treatments that had previously been successful. These professional difficulties served as clear indicators that supernatural interference was affecting the spiritual mechanisms that powered traditional healing practices. The behavior of children provided particularly sensitive indicators of Skinwalker presence, as young individuals possessed natural spiritual sensitivity that had not yet been dulled by adult concerns and responsibilities. Children would often become unusually fearful or clingy, refusing to play in areas where they had previously felt comfortable or showing reluctance to venture outside during times when they would normally be active. Their play activities might change to incorporate themes of danger, transformation, or supernatural threat that reflected their subconscious awareness of the spiritual disturbances affecting their environment. Infants and very young children would display physical symptoms of distress when exposed to Skinwalker influence, crying inconsolably without apparent cause, refusing to sleep in certain areas, or showing signs of illness that could not be attributed to normal childhood ailments. Traditional caregivers understood these reactions as indicators that the children's natural spiritual sensitivity was detecting threats that adult awareness had not yet recognized, treating such symptoms as warnings that required immediate investigation and protective response. The gradual accumulation of multiple warning signs created patterns that experienced observers could learn to recognize as indicating escalating levels of Skinwalker threat. The initial appearance of subtle environmental disturbances would be followed by increasing animal distress, then by spiritual disruptions affecting ceremonial practices, and finally by direct encounters or attacks. Understanding this progression allowed traditional communities to implement appropriate protective measures at each stage, potentially preventing minor spiritual disturbances from developing into serious supernatural crises that threatened the safety and spiritual well-being of entire populations. The recognition of warning signs inevitably led to the implementation of sophisticated protective measures that had been developed and refined through generations of confrontations with supernatural threats. Traditional Diné communities possessed an extensive arsenal of spiritual defenses that operated on multiple levels, from individual protective practices to community-wide ceremonial interventions that could shield entire settlements from Skinwalker predation. These defensive systems represented the accumulated wisdom of countless medicine people who had dedicated their lives to understanding the spiritual mechanics governing the relationship between human communities and the malevolent forces that sought to corrupt or destroy them. The foundation of all protective measures rested upon specific prayers and incantations that had been passed down through generations of spiritual practitioners, each word and phrase carefully preserved to maintain the precise spiritual resonance necessary for effective protection. These prayers were not simple requests for divine intervention, but complex spiritual formulas that activated specific protective mechanisms within the traditional cosmological framework. The Hosho prayer cycle formed the cornerstone of daily protective practice, establishing and maintaining the spiritual harmony that served as the primary defense against supernatural corruption. These prayers required precise pronunciation and timing, as even minor variations could reduce their effectiveness or, in extreme cases, create spiritual vulnerabilities that malevolent entities could exploit. The morning protection prayers began before dawn, when the spiritual boundaries between night and day were most permeable and required careful management to prevent negative forces from carrying over into the daylight hours. Traditional practitioners would face the eastern direction, acknowledging the holy people associated with new beginnings and spiritual purification, while reciting specific invocations that establish protective barriers around themselves, their families, and their communities. These dawn prayers incorporated references to the sacred mountains that defined Diné territory, calling upon the spiritual power contained within these geographical landmarks to extend protection across the landscape inhabited by the people. Evening protective prayers served a different but equally crucial function, creating spiritual barriers that would remain effective throughout the dangerous hours of darkness when Skinwalker activity reached its peak intensity. These sunset invocations acknowledged the increased spiritual dangers associated with nighttime, while calling upon the protective power of specific holy people who maintained their vigilance during the hours when malevolent forces gained enhanced influence over events in the physical world. The evening prayers required practitioners to face each of the 4 sacred directions in sequence, establishing a complete protective perimeter that would shield their dwellings and immediate surroundings from supernatural intrusion. Specialized protection prayers existed for specific situations that created heightened vulnerability to Skinwalker attack. Travelers embarking on journeys that would take them far from their home communities possessed prayers designed to maintain protective connections across vast distances, ensuring that the spiritual bonds linking them to their families and protective ceremonies remained intact despite physical separation. These travel prayers incorporated geographical references to the specific routes being travelled, calling upon the holy people associated with particular landmarks, water sources, and territorial boundaries to extend protection along the entire journey. Hunters and herders who spent extended periods alone in remote areas required specialized protective invocations that acknowledged the increased spiritual dangers associated with isolation, while establishing connections to protective forces that could operate independently of community support. These occupational prayers often incorporated elements specific to the animals being hunted or herded, recognizing the spiritual relationships that existed between humans and the creatures they depended upon for survival, while ensuring that these relationships remained balanced and harmonious rather than exploitative or corrupting. The construction and maintenance of prayer bundles represented another fundamental aspect of individual spiritual protection that required specialized knowledge and careful attention to traditional protocols. These sacred objects contained specific combinations of blessed materials that had been consecrated through elaborate ceremonies designed to imbue them with protective power capable of repelling supernatural threats. The contents of protection bundles varied according to their intended purpose and the spiritual needs of their owners, but typically included blessed herbs, stones from sacred locations, and small objects that had been exposed to powerful protective ceremonies. Sage bundles formed the most common type of protective object, as this sacred plant possessed natural purification properties that could cleanse spiritual contamination and create barriers against malevolent spiritual influences. The preparation of sage bundles required careful attention to traditional harvesting protocols, including prayers of gratitude to the plant spirits and specific timing that ensured the sage was collected during periods when its spiritual potency was at maximum strength. The bundled sage had to be properly dried and stored in containers that had been blessed through appropriate ceremonies, maintaining its spiritual effectiveness until the time came for its use in protective rituals. Cedar bundles provided another category of protective object that specialized in creating spiritual barriers against shape-shifting entities and other supernatural predators. The aromatic smoke produced by burning cedar was believed to be particularly offensive to skinwalkers and other corrupted beings, creating an atmospheric barrier that these entities found difficult to penetrate. Traditional practitioners often carried small cedar bundles during travel, or kept larger quantities in their homes to provide continuous protection against supernatural intrusion. Sweetgrass bundles served specialized protective functions related to prayer and ceremonial activities, as the sweet smoke produced by this sacred plant was believed to carry human prayers more effectively to the holy people while creating spiritual conditions that enhanced the power of protective ceremonies. The preparation of sweetgrass bundles required even more specialized knowledge than sage or cedar preparation, as this plant had to be braided according to specific patterns that reflected traditional spiritual principles, while being blessed through ceremonies that activated its prayer-carrying capabilities. Sacred stones and crystals formed another category of protective objects that drew their power from their connection to the spiritual forces contained within the sacred mountains and other geological features that defined Diné territory. These stones had to be gathered from specific locations during appropriate ceremonial contexts, with proper prayers and offerings made to the spiritual entities that governed those places. The most powerful protective stones came from the sacred mountains themselves, requiring dangerous journeys and elaborate ceremonial preparations to obtain them safely. Turquoise held special significance within the traditional system of protective objects, as this sacred stone was believed to contain concentrated spiritual power that could repel supernatural threats while strengthening the spiritual connections that linked individuals to their protective ceremonies and community support systems. Turquoise beads were often incorporated into prayer bundles or worn as personal protective jewellery, their blue-green colour serving as a visual reminder of the spiritual protection they provided, while their physical presence created a constant barrier against negative spiritual influences. Shell beads and other materials obtained from distant locations through traditional trade networks provided additional protective elements that drew their power from their connection to spiritual forces beyond the immediate Diné territory. These exotic materials had to be properly blessed and incorporated into the local spiritual system through appropriate ceremonies, creating protective objects that combined local spiritual power with influences from other geographical regions and their associated spiritual traditions. The role of medicine people in maintaining community protection extended far beyond their individual healing practices to encompass comprehensive spiritual defense systems that required constant attention and periodic renewal. These spiritual leaders served as the primary interface between their communities and the protective spiritual forces that governed their territories, maintaining the ceremonial relationships that ensured continued protection while monitoring the spiritual environment for signs of supernatural threat or corruption. Diagnostic ceremonies formed a crucial component of the medicine people's protective responsibilities, as these elaborate rituals allowed spiritual practitioners to assess the spiritual condition of individuals, families, and entire communities while identifying specific threats that required targeted, defensive measures. The hand-trembling ceremony represented one of the most important diagnostic tools available to traditional practitioners, enabling experienced medicine people to identify the source and nature of spiritual disturbances that were affecting their patients or communities. The hand-trembling practitioner would enter a trance state through the use of specific prayers and ceremonial procedures, allowing their consciousness to access spiritual information that was not available through normal sensory perception. During this altered state of consciousness, the practitioner's hand would begin trembling in patterns that conveyed information about the spiritual forces affecting the situation being investigated. Experienced practitioners could interpret these trembling patterns to determine whether supernatural threats were present, identify the specific type of malevolent entity involved, and prescribe appropriate protective or healing measures. Stargazing ceremonies provided another diagnostic tool that allowed medicine people to gather information about spiritual threats by observing the behavior of celestial bodies and interpreting their movements according to traditional astronomical knowledge. These ceremonies required practitioners who possessed detailed understanding of seasonal star patterns and their spiritual significance, as the information conveyed through celestial observation was often subtle and required considerable expertise to interpret correctly. Stargazing ceremonies were particularly useful for detecting supernatural threats that were still developing or that were being directed from distant locations. Crystal gazing represented a third category of diagnostic ceremony that utilized specially prepared crystal balls or other reflective objects to access spiritual information about supernatural threats and protective needs. These ceremonies required crystals that had been consecrated through elaborate blessing rituals and could only be performed by practitioners who had undergone specific training in the interpretation of the visions that appeared within the crystal's surface. The information obtained through crystal gazing often provided detailed insights into the methods and motivations of supernatural threats, allowing communities to develop targeted defensive strategies. Protective ceremonies conducted by medicine people range from simple blessing rituals that could be completed in a few hours to elaborate multi-day events that required the participation of entire communities and the coordination of multiple spiritual practitioners. The Blessing Away ceremony represented the most fundamental protective ritual within the traditional Diné ceremonial system, designed to establish and maintain the spiritual harmony that served as the foundation for all other protective measures. This ceremony could be adapted to address various protective needs, from blessing new homes and protecting newborn children to purifying communities that had been affected by supernatural contamination. The Enemy Way ceremony provided specialized protection against supernatural threats and spiritual contamination, incorporating powerful purification rituals that could cleanse individuals or communities that had been exposed to malevolent spiritual influences. This ceremony required extensive preparation and could only be performed by medicine people who possessed the specialized knowledge necessary to safely conduct the dangerous purification procedures involved. The Enemy Way ceremony was particularly effective against Skinwalker contamination, as its purification rituals were specifically designed to neutralize the spiritual pollution that these corrupted beings spread through their activities. Protection ceremonies designed specifically to counter Skinwalker threats incorporated elements that directly addressed the unique characteristics of these supernatural predators. These specialized rituals included prayers that specifically named and banished shape-shifting entities, ceremonial procedures that strengthened the spiritual boundaries between human and animal consciousness, and purification rites that could neutralize the death-related contamination that powered Skinwalker abilities. The performance of these anti-Skinwalker ceremonies required medicine people who possessed detailed knowledge of the spiritual mechanics governing transformation magic and who had the spiritual strength necessary to confront these dangerous entities directly. The preparation of protective substances represented another crucial aspect of traditional spiritual defense that required specialized knowledge of the spiritual properties possessed by various natural materials. Holy water prepared through specific blessing ceremonies could create barriers against supernatural intrusion when sprinkled around homes, camps, or other areas requiring protection. This blessed water had to be obtained from sacred springs or other spiritually significant water sources, then consecrated through elaborate ceremonies that imbued it with protective power capable of repelling malevolent spiritual influences. Blessed cornmeal served multiple protective functions within traditional defensive practices, as this sacred substance could be scattered around protective perimeters, offered to protective spiritual entities, or incorporated into prayer bundles and other protective objects. The preparation of blessed cornmeal required corn that had been grown according to traditional agricultural practices, harvested with appropriate ceremonies, and ground using tools that had been consecrated for sacred purposes. The blessing process involved specific prayers and ceremonial procedures that activated the cornmeal's protective properties while establishing spiritual connections to the agricultural ceremonies that governed the relationship between the Diné people and their cultivated crops. Protective paints and pigments created from blessed minerals and plant materials provided another category of defensive substances that could be applied to buildings, ceremonial objects, or even human skin to create barriers against supernatural attack. These sacred paints required minerals that had been gathered from spiritually significant locations and blessed through appropriate ceremonies, combined with plant-based binders that had been prepared according to traditional protocols. The application of protective paints followed specific patterns and designs that reflected traditional spiritual principles, while creating visual symbols that reinforced the spiritual barriers being established. Herbal preparations designed for protection against supernatural threats incorporated plants that possessed natural spiritual properties capable of repelling malevolent entities or neutralizing spiritual contamination. Ghost beads, a traditional plant medicine, could be prepared as a tea that provided internal protection against spiritual attack, or as a wash that could be applied to the skin or clothing to create external barriers against supernatural intrusion. The preparation of ghost beads medicine required careful attention to traditional harvesting and processing protocols, as improper preparation could reduce its effectiveness or create unintended spiritual consequences. Community-based protection strategies recognize that individual defensive measures, while important, required coordination with broader community efforts to create comprehensive protection against supernatural threats that could affect entire populations. Group ceremonies that involved multiple families or entire communities created protective barriers that were far more powerful than those achievable through individual efforts alone, as the combined spiritual energy of many participants could establish and maintain defensive systems that would be impossible for isolated individuals to create. Seasonal protection ceremonies brought entire communities together to renew and strengthen the spiritual barriers that protected their territories from supernatural intrusion. These large-scale ceremonial events typically coincided with significant astronomical events or seasonal transitions, when spiritual boundaries required reinforcement against the increased supernatural activity that accompanied these periods of cosmic change. The coordination of community-wide protective ceremonies required careful planning and the cooperation of multiple medicine people who could contribute their specialized knowledge and spiritual power to the collective defensive effort. The establishment of protected zones around communities involved the creation of spiritual boundaries that extended beyond individual homes or families to encompass entire settlements and their surrounding territories. These community-wide protective barriers required the coordinated efforts of multiple medicine people working together to establish and maintain spiritual perimeters that could repel supernatural threats while allowing normal human activities to continue without interference. The maintenance of community protective zones required regular ceremonial renewal and constant vigilance to detect and repair any weaknesses that might develop in the spiritual barriers. Emergency protection protocols provided communities with rapid response capabilities that could be implemented when immediate supernatural threats required urgent defensive measures. These emergency procedures included abbreviated versions of longer protective ceremonies that could be performed quickly when time was critical, as well as coordinated community actions that could create temporary protective barriers while more elaborate defensive measures were being organized. The effectiveness of emergency protection protocols depended upon community members' familiarity with their roles and responsibilities, requiring regular training and practice to ensure that defensive measures could be implemented quickly and effectively when supernatural threats materialized. The preservation of sacred knowledge represented perhaps the most crucial aspect of long-term community protection, as the spiritual wisdom contained within traditional defensive practices had to be carefully maintained and transmitted to future generations to ensure continued protection against supernatural threats. This knowledge preservation involved not only the memorization of prayers, songs, and ceremonial procedures, but also the understanding of the spiritual principles that govern their effectiveness and the ability to adapt traditional practices to address new or evolving supernatural threats. Training programs for young people who showed aptitude for spiritual practice ensured that protective knowledge would be available to future generations, while maintaining the high standards of spiritual discipline required for effective defensive work. These training programs typically extended over many years and required students to demonstrate both intellectual mastery of ceremonial procedures and the spiritual maturity necessary to handle dangerous supernatural forces safely. The selection and training of future medicine people represented a crucial investment in community security that required careful attention to the character and capabilities of potential spiritual practitioners. The identification of Skinwalker presence within traditional Diné communities required medicine people to employ sophisticated diagnostic techniques that operated far beyond simple observation of physical symptoms or environmental disturbances. These spiritual practitioners possessed specialized training that enabled them to perceive the subtle spiritual disruptions created by corrupted entities, distinguishing between ordinary illness or misfortune and the specific patterns of spiritual contamination that marked supernatural predation. The diagnostic process began with careful examination of the victim's spiritual condition, using traditional methods that could reveal the presence of foreign spiritual influences and determine the specific type of supernatural threat that was affecting the individual or community. The hand-trembling diagnostic ceremony provided medicine people with detailed information about the nature and source of spiritual disturbances that were affecting their patients. During this ritual, the practitioner would enter a trance state through the recitation of specific prayers and the manipulation of sacred objects, allowing their consciousness to access spiritual information that remained hidden from normal perception. The practitioner's hand would begin trembling in distinctive patterns that conveyed precise details about the spiritual forces involved in the case, including whether the disturbance resulted from Skinwalker activity, other supernatural threats, or natural spiritual imbalances that required different treatment approaches. Experienced hand-trembling practitioners could interpret the trembling patterns to determine not only the presence of Skinwalker influence, but also specific details about the corrupted entity's methods, motivations, and current location. The intensity and rhythm of the trembling provided information about the strength of the supernatural threat, while the direction in which the hand moved indicated the geographical source of the spiritual attack. The duration of different trembling episodes revealed the timeline of the supernatural assault, allowing medicine people to understand how long the victim had been under attack and what stages of spiritual corruption had already been completed. Stargazing ceremonies offered another diagnostic approach that utilized traditional astronomical knowledge to gather information about supernatural threats through observation of celestial movements and atmospheric phenomena. These rituals required practitioners who possessed intimate familiarity with seasonal star patterns and their spiritual significance, as the information conveyed through astronomical observation often appeared in subtle forms that demanded considerable expertise to interpret correctly. Stargazing practitioners would conduct their ceremonies during specific astronomical conditions, when the spiritual connections between earthly events and celestial movements became most clearly visible. The diagnostic information obtained through stargazing ceremonies often provided crucial details about the timing and scope of Skinwalker attacks that were not available through other methods. Practitioners could determine whether supernatural threats were still developing or had reached their full intensity, identify the specific times when attacks were most likely to occur, and predict the future movements of Skinwalker entities based on their observed patterns of spiritual activity. This temporal information proved invaluable for communities attempting to organize protective measures or plan counterattacks against supernatural predators. Crystal gazing represented a third category of diagnostic ceremony that employed specially prepared crystal balls or other reflective surfaces to access detailed visual information about Skinwalker activities and intentions. These ceremonies required crystals that had been consecrated through elaborate blessing rituals and could only be performed by practitioners who had undergone extensive training in the interpretation of spiritual visions. The images that appeared within the crystal's surface provided medicine people with direct visual access to events occurring in distant locations, allowing them to observe Skinwalker activities in real time and gather intelligence about their plans and capabilities. The visions obtained through crystal gazing often revealed specific details about Skinwalker transformation processes, hunting methods, and the locations where these entities maintained their bases of operation. Practitioners could observe the corrupted beings in their various animal forms, witness their interactions with controlled animals and spiritual allies, and even perceive the spiritual connections that link Skinwalkers to their intended victims. This visual intelligence proved crucial for developing effective counter-strategies and identifying the specific weaknesses that could be exploited in direct confrontations. Spiritual diagnosis also involved the examination of physical evidence that reflected the supernatural contamination affecting victims of Skinwalker attack. Medicine people possessed the ability to perceive spiritual emanations from objects, locations, and even people that had been exposed to supernatural influence, detecting traces of corruption that remained invisible to ordinary observation. This spiritual forensics required practitioners to examine contaminated materials while maintaining careful protective barriers around themselves, as direct contact with spiritually polluted substances could result in the contamination of the examining practitioner. The analysis of contaminated objects revealed crucial information about the specific methods employed by Skinwalkers in their attacks. Hair, clothing, or personal items that had been exposed to Skinwalker influence retained traces of the spiritual contamination that could be analysed to determine the type of corruption involved, the duration of exposure, and the specific supernatural abilities that had been used against the victim. Medicine people could also detect the presence of foreign spiritual substances that had been deliberately introduced into the victim's environment, identifying cursed objects or spiritually poisoned materials that required immediate removal and purification. The confrontation of dark spiritual forces represented one of the most dangerous aspects of traditional medicine practice, requiring extensive spiritual preparation and the implementation of multiple layers of protective measures before any direct engagement with supernatural threats could be safely attempted. Medicine people who specialized in combating Skinwalkers and other malevolent entities underwent years of additional training beyond their basic healing education, developing the spiritual strength and specialized knowledge necessary to survive direct encounters with corrupted beings whose power often exceeded that of ordinary supernatural entities. The spiritual preparation required for anti-Skinwalker operations began with intensive purification ceremonies that strengthened the practitioner's spiritual defenses while severing any vulnerable connections that might provide supernatural predators with access to the medicine person's consciousness or spiritual energy. These preparatory rituals typically extended over several days and required the practitioner to maintain strict fasting, sexual abstinence, and other forms of spiritual discipline that enhanced their connection to protective spiritual forces while reducing their vulnerability to spiritual attack. Protective ceremonies specific to anti-Skinwalker work incorporated prayers and ritual procedures that were not used in ordinary healing practices, as these specialized invocations were considered too dangerous for general use and could only be safely employed by practitioners who possessed the spiritual strength necessary to handle their power. These protective rituals established spiritual barriers around the medicine person that were specifically designed to repel shape-shifting entities and neutralize the death-related contamination that powered their supernatural abilities. The preparation of specialized ceremonial materials for anti-Skinwalker work required medicine people to create or obtain objects that possessed specific spiritual properties capable of affecting corrupted entities. Sacred weapons blessed through elaborate consecration ceremonies could inflict spiritual damage on skinwalkers that ordinary physical weapons could not achieve, while protective amulets created from specially prepared materials provided defense against the supernatural abilities that these entities employed in combat. The creation of these specialized tools often required rare materials that had to be obtained from dangerous locations or through complex trade relationships with other spiritual practitioners. Blessed arrows represented one category of spiritual weapon that proved particularly effective against skinwalker entities, as these projectiles could penetrate the supernatural defenses that protected corrupted beings from ordinary physical attacks. The preparation of blessed arrows required arrowheads made from specific types of stone that had been gathered from sacred locations, shafts cut from wood that had been blessed through appropriate ceremonies, and fletching created from feathers obtained from birds that possessed natural spiritual power. The blessing process involved elaborate ceremonies that imbued the arrows with spiritual energy capable of disrupting the supernatural forces that maintained skinwalker transformations. Sacred knives and other bladed weapons provided medicine people with close combat capabilities against supernatural threats that could not be effectively engaged at a distance. These weapons required blades forged from meteoric iron or other materials that possessed natural spiritual properties, combined with handles made from blessed wood or bone that had been consecrated through appropriate rituals. The spiritual power contained within these weapons allowed them to cut through the supernatural defenses that protected skinwalkers while inflicting wounds that would heal slowly or not at all due to the spiritual contamination introduced by the blessed blade. Protective shields created from specially prepared animal hides provided defense against the supernatural attacks that skinwalkers could direct against their opponents during direct confrontations. These shields required hides from animals that had been killed according to specific ceremonial protocols, then treated with blessed substances and decorated with protective symbols that enhanced their spiritual defensive capabilities. The completed shields could deflect or absorb supernatural attacks that would otherwise prove devastating to unprotected medicine people, though their effectiveness was limited and required careful maintenance through regular blessing ceremonies. The tactical approaches employed in direct confrontations with skinwalkers reflected the unique characteristics of these supernatural predators and the specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited by properly prepared opponents. Unlike ordinary combat situations that relied primarily on physical strength and conventional weapons, anti-skinwalker warfare required medicine people to employ spiritual tactics that targeted the corrupted entity's supernatural abilities while avoiding the numerous advantages that shapeshifting provided in conventional combat scenarios. Spiritual binding techniques represented one of the most effective tactical approaches for neutralizing skinwalker threats without requiring direct physical confrontation. These methods involved the use of specific prayers and ceremonial procedures that could trap skinwalkers in their current form, preventing them from shapeshifting to escape capture or adopt more dangerous animal characteristics. The binding process required medicine people to maintain continuous concentration while reciting complex incantations that created spiritual constraints around the target entity, gradually tightening these supernatural bonds until the skinwalker became unable to access their transformation abilities. Banishment rituals provided another tactical option that could force skinwalkers to abandon their current territory and cease their predatory activities against specific communities. These ceremonies required the coordinated efforts of multiple medicine people working together to create spiritual barriers that made it impossible for the corrupted entities to remain in the affected area. The banishment process typically involved the establishment of protective perimeters around the threatened community, followed by elaborate purification ceremonies that cleansed the spiritual contamination left behind by skinwalker activities. Spiritual combat techniques allowed medicine people to engage skinwalkers directly in supernatural warfare that took place primarily in the spiritual realm, while manifesting secondary effects in the physical world. These combat methods required practitioners to project their consciousness into spiritual dimensions where they could confront skinwalkers using abilities that matched or exceeded the corrupted entity's supernatural powers. The outcome of spiritual combat was determined by the relative spiritual strength of the participants and their mastery of the specialized techniques required for supernatural warfare. The traditional methods and spiritual tools believed effective in spiritual protection evolved through generations of practical experience with supernatural threats, incorporating lessons learned from both successful defensive operations and tragic failures that revealed weaknesses in existing protective systems. These methods operated on multiple levels simultaneously, addressing the physical, psychological, and spiritual aspects of supernatural predation, while providing communities with comprehensive defense capabilities that could adapt to various types of supernatural threats. Protective ceremonies designed specifically to counter Skinwalker abilities incorporated ritual elements that directly addressed the unique characteristics of these shape-shifting predators. The Enemy Ghost Ceremony represented one of the most powerful anti-Skinwalker rituals available to traditional practitioners, combining purification procedures that could neutralize spiritual contamination with protective invocations that established barriers against future supernatural attacks. This ceremony required extensive preparation and could only be performed by medicine people who possess specialized knowledge of the spiritual mechanics governing Skinwalker transformations. The ritual components of anti-Skinwalker ceremonies included specific prayers that named and banished shape-shifting entities, ceremonial procedures that strengthened the spiritual boundaries between human and animal consciousness, and purification rites that could neutralize the death-related contamination that powered Skinwalker abilities. The prayers used in these ceremonies were considered particularly dangerous and could only be recited by practitioners who had undergone appropriate spiritual preparation, as improper use of these powerful invocations could result in spiritual contamination or attract the attention of other malevolent entities. Ceremonial sand paintings created for anti-Skinwalker work incorporated symbolic elements that represented the spiritual forces involved in shape-shifting magic and the protective powers that could counter these abilities. These sand paintings required precise execution according to traditional patterns that had been passed down through generations of specialized practitioners, as even minor errors in their construction could reduce their effectiveness or create unintended spiritual consequences. The completed sand paintings served as focal points for the spiritual energy generated during anti-Skinwalker ceremonies, concentrating protective power in ways that enhanced the overall effectiveness of the ritual procedures. Sacred objects used in anti-Skinwalker ceremonies included items that possess specific spiritual properties capable of affecting corrupted entities and neutralizing their supernatural abilities. Medicine bundles prepared specifically for supernatural warfare contained combinations of blessed materials that had been consecrated through elaborate ceremonies designed to imbue them with power capable of repelling shape-shifting predators. These specialized bundles typically included herbs that were offensive to skinwalkers, stones that could disrupt transformation magic, and other materials that had been exposed to powerful protective ceremonies. The restoration of spiritual balance following encounters with corrupted spiritual forces required comprehensive purification procedures that addressed both the immediate contamination created by direct contact with skinwalkers and the long-term spiritual damage that could result from exposure to their corrupting influence. These restoration processes recognized that spiritual contamination could persist long after the initial supernatural encounter had ended, continuing to affect individuals and communities in ways that gradually undermined their spiritual health and resistance to future supernatural attacks. Purification ceremonies for skinwalker contamination involved elaborate ritual procedures that were specifically designed to neutralize the death-related spiritual pollution that these entities spread through their activities. The Enemy ceremony provided the most comprehensive purification available for serious cases of supernatural contamination, incorporating multiple days of intensive ritual procedures that gradually cleansed the spiritual pollution while rebuilding the victim's connection to protective spiritual forces. This ceremony required the participation of experienced medicine people who possessed the specialized knowledge necessary to safely conduct the dangerous purification procedures involved. Individual purification procedures included ritual baths using water that had been blessed through appropriate ceremonies, the consumption of herbal medicines that could neutralize spiritual contamination from within the body, and the application of protective paints and substances that created barriers against residual supernatural influence. These individual treatments typically required multiple applications over extended periods, as the spiritual contamination created by Skinwalker contact was particularly persistent and required sustained purification efforts to eliminate completely. Community healing processes addressed the broader spiritual damage that Skinwalker activity could inflict on entire settlements, recognizing that the corruption spread by these entities could affect the spiritual environment in ways that influenced all community members regardless of their direct involvement in supernatural encounters. Community purification ceremonies involved the coordinated efforts of multiple medicine people working together to cleanse contaminated areas, restore protective barriers, and re-establish the spiritual harmony that served as the foundation for community spiritual health. The restoration of sacred spaces that had been contaminated by Skinwalker activity required specialized purification procedures that could neutralize spiritual pollution while restoring the protective power that these locations had previously provided. Contaminated ceremonial grounds had to be thoroughly cleansed through elaborate purification rituals before they could safely be used for spiritual activities again, while sacred objects that had been exposed to supernatural contamination required individual purification procedures that addressed their specific spiritual needs. Long-term spiritual rehabilitation for individuals who had survived serious Skinwalker encounters involved ongoing ceremonial support that helped them rebuild their spiritual defenses while processing the psychological trauma associated with supernatural predation. These rehabilitation programs typically extended over months or even years, providing survivors with the spiritual guidance and ceremonial support necessary to fully recover from their encounters with corrupted spiritual forces while developing enhanced resistance to future supernatural attacks. The spiritual traditions surrounding shape-shifting entities extended far beyond the boundaries of Diné territory, manifesting in distinct yet related forms among numerous tribal nations across the North American continent. Each indigenous culture developed its own understanding of supernatural transformation based on their unique environmental conditions, spiritual practices, and historical experiences with entities that violated the natural boundaries between human and animal consciousness. These diverse traditions shared common themes of spiritual corruption and the dangerous consequences of misusing sacred knowledge, while maintaining distinct cultural characteristics that reflected the specific worldviews and ceremonial systems of their respective communities. Among the Hopi people of northeastern Arizona, the concept of spiritual transformation took on characteristics that reflected their agricultural lifestyle and their complex ceremonial calendar centered around seasonal cycles and clan-based spiritual responsibilities. The Hopi understanding of corrupted shapeshifters, known as Powaka, emphasized the connection between spiritual contamination and the violation of proper agricultural and ceremonial protocols. Unlike the Diné focus on individual medicine people who had corrupted their healing abilities, Hopi traditions described Powaka as individuals who had violated their clan responsibilities and ceremonial obligations, thereby severing their connections to the spiritual forces that maintained agricultural abundance and community harmony. The Hopi Powaka were believed to gain their transformation abilities through the deliberate corruption of Kachina ceremonies and the misuse of sacred objects associated with clan spiritual practices. These corrupted individuals would steal ceremonial masks, contaminate sacred cornmeal with spiritually polluting substances, or perform inverted versions of agricultural blessing ceremonies designed to bring drought and crop failure rather than abundance. The transformation process involved the gradual replacement of the individual's clan-based spiritual identity with predatory characteristics that had aligned them with destructive spiritual forces opposed to agricultural prosperity and community cooperation. The animal forms adopted by Hopi Powaka reflected the specific environmental conditions of the high desert mesas where their communities were located, with coyotes, ravens and owls being the most commonly reported transformation shapes. These animals possessed characteristics that made them particularly suited to the rocky terrain and sparse vegetation of Hopi territory, while their natural behaviours aligned with the predatory nature that corrupted individuals developed through their spiritual degradation. Coyote form Powaka were described as being capable of moving through the complex maze of canyons and mesa formations with supernatural speed and stealth, using their intimate knowledge of the landscape to approach their victims undetected. The Hopi understanding of shapeshifter motivation centered around the concept of spiritual jealousy and the desire to disrupt the agricultural cycles that sustained their communities. Powaka were believed to target successful farmers, skilled craftspeople, and individuals who possessed particular expertise in ceremonial activities, seeking to steal their knowledge or destroy their capabilities through supernatural attack. This focus on agricultural and ceremonial disruption reflected the central importance of farming and seasonal ceremonies within Hopi culture, where the spiritual well-being of the entire community depended upon the proper performance of clan-based rituals and the maintenance of harmonious relationships with the spiritual forces governing crop growth and seasonal changes. The Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande Valley developed their own distinct understanding of shape-shifting entities that incorporated elements from both their agricultural traditions and their experiences with nomadic raiders who periodically threatened their settled communities. The Pueblo concept of spiritual transformation emphasized the connection between shape-shifting abilities and warfare magic, describing corrupted individuals who had perverted traditional warrior ceremonies to gain supernatural advantages in combat and raiding activities. These transformed warriors, known by various names among different Pueblo groups, were believed to adopt animal forms that enhanced their effectiveness as raiders, while allowing them to approach enemy settlements without being detected by normal human sentries. The transformation rituals described in Pueblo traditions involved the deliberate corruption of war medicine and the violation of the spiritual protocols that governed legitimate warrior activities. Traditional Pueblo warfare was conducted according to strict spiritual guidelines that emphasized the protection of non-combatants, the proper treatment of captives, and the maintenance of spiritual balance even during periods of conflict. Corrupted warriors violated these protocols by targeting civilians, desecrating enemy dead, and using spiritual contamination as a weapon against their opponents, gradually transforming themselves into predatory entities that retained human intelligence while adopting the ruthless characteristics of their chosen animal forms. The animal forms favoured by Pueblo shapeshifters reflected the military advantages they sought to gain through their transformation, with wolves, bears and mountain lions being the most commonly adopted shapes. Wolf-form shapeshifters gained enhanced pack hunting abilities that made them effective at coordinating group attacks against enemy settlements, while bear-form entities possessed the raw physical power necessary to breach defensive fortifications and overpower multiple opponents simultaneously. Mountain lion shapeshifters specialized in stealth attacks and assassination, using their supernatural agility and silent movement to eliminate specific targets without alerting their communities to the presence of supernatural threats. The Apache nations of the Southwest developed shapeshifter traditions that reflected their nomadic lifestyle and their complex relationship with the diverse environments they inhabited during their seasonal migrations. Apache understanding of spiritual transformation emphasized the connection between shape-shifting abilities and the violation of the spiritual protocols that governed proper relationships with animal spirits and the natural forces that controlled weather patterns and seasonal changes. Apache shapeshifters, known as skinwalkers in some groups but distinguished from Diné skinwalkers by their different cultural context and transformation methods, were described as individuals who had corrupted their roles as spiritual intermediaries between human communities and the animal spirits that provided guidance during hunting and migration activities. The Apache transformation process involved the deliberate violation of hunting taboos and the corruption of the ceremonial relationships that traditionally governed human interactions with animal spirits. Legitimate Apache spiritual practices included ceremonies that allowed hunters and scouts to temporarily adopt certain animal characteristics for practical purposes, such as enhanced tracking abilities or improved endurance during long-distance travel. However, these legitimate transformations were always temporary and conducted within carefully controlled ceremonial contexts that maintained the practitioner's essential human identity while preventing permanent alteration of their spiritual nature. Corrupted Apache practitioners perverted these traditional ceremonies by seeking permanent transformation abilities that would grant them supernatural advantages without the spiritual discipline and moral restraints that governed legitimate spiritual practice. The corruption process typically began with the violation of hunting protocols, such as killing animals during inappropriate seasons, failing to perform proper gratitude ceremonies after successful hunts, or taking more game than was needed for community survival. These violations gradually weakened the individual's connection to the animal spirits, while creating spiritual imbalances that made them susceptible to more serious forms of corruption. The animal forms adopted by Apache shapeshifters reflected the diverse environments they encountered during their migrations, with different individuals specializing in forms that provided advantages in specific geographical regions. Desert-adapted shapeshifters might adopt coyote or rattlesnake forms that allowed them to navigate arid environments with enhanced efficiency, while those operating in mountainous regions might choose bear or wolf forms that provided advantages in cold, high-altitude conditions. Coastal Apache groups developed shapeshifter traditions that included aquatic animal forms such as seals or sea otters, reflecting their adaptation to maritime environments and their need for supernatural abilities that functioned effectively in both terrestrial and marine settings. The Navajo understanding of Apache shapeshifters recognized them as distinct from their own Skinwalker traditions, while acknowledging the similar spiritual mechanisms that governed both types of transformation. Diné medicine people who specialized in combating supernatural threats possess specific knowledge about the different characteristics and vulnerabilities of Apache shapeshifters, understanding that their different cultural origins and transformation methods required modified defensive strategies and purification procedures. The interaction between Diné and Apache shapeshifter traditions created complex dynamics in regions where these cultures overlapped, with practitioners from both traditions sometimes cooperating against common threats while maintaining their distinct cultural identities and ceremonial practices. Moving beyond the southwest, the tribal nations of the Great Plains developed their own understanding of spiritual transformation that reflected their buffalo hunting lifestyle and their complex relationships with the vast grassland environments they inhabited. Plains tribes such as the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Blackfoot possessed shapeshifter traditions that emphasized the connection between transformation abilities and the corruption of buffalo ceremonies and the spiritual relationships that governed successful hunting practices. These traditions described corrupted individuals who had violated the sacred protocols governing buffalo hunts, thereby severing their connections to the buffalo spirits while gaining the ability to adopt predatory animal forms that allowed them to hunt human prey with supernatural effectiveness. The Plains' understanding of shapeshifter transformation centered around the concept of spiritual greed and the violation of the reciprocal relationships that governed proper hunting practices. Traditional plains hunting ceremonies emphasize gratitude to the buffalo spirits, the sharing of meat according to established social protocols, and the use of all parts of killed animals to prevent waste and demonstrate respect for the animal's sacrifice. Corrupted hunters violated these protocols by killing more buffalo than their communities could use, failing to perform proper gratitude ceremonies, or using buffalo products for personal gain rather than community benefit. The transformation abilities gained through the corruption of buffalo ceremonies typically manifested in forms that reflected the predatory characteristics that corrupted individuals had developed through their spiritual degradation. Wolf forms were particularly common among plains shapeshifters, as these animals possessed natural pack-hunting abilities that aligned with the group-oriented nature of buffalo hunting, while providing enhanced capabilities for pursuing human prey across the vast distances of grassland terrain. Bear forms provided corrupted individuals with the physical power necessary to overpower buffalo-sized prey, while also granting them the supernatural durability required to survive the dangerous confrontations that their predatory activities inevitably created. The seasonal migration patterns followed by plains tribes created unique challenges for communities attempting to protect themselves against shapeshifter predation, as traditional defensive measures had to be adapted to function effectively during periods of constant movement across diverse geographical regions. Plains medicine people developed portable protection systems that could be quickly established at temporary camps while providing effective defense against supernatural threats that might follow migrating communities across hundreds of miles of open terrain. These mobile defensive systems incorporated lightweight ceremonial objects, abbreviated protective ceremonies that could be performed quickly during travel stops, and early warning systems that utilized the enhanced mobility of plains scouts to detect supernatural threats before they could approach migrating communities. The northern tribal nations of the subarctic regions developed shapeshifter traditions that reflected their adaptation to harsh winter conditions and their dependence on hunting and fishing for survival in environments where plant foods were scarce or seasonally unavailable. Tribes such as the Cree, Ojibwe, and Innu possessed understanding of spiritual transformation that emphasized the connection between shape-shifting abilities and the corruption of the spiritual relationships governing survival in extreme cold conditions. These traditions described corrupted individuals who had violated the taboos governing winter survival practices, thereby gaining supernatural abilities that allowed them to thrive in conditions that would prove fatal to normal humans while losing their essential humanity in the process. The northern understanding of shapeshifter transformation involved the deliberate violation of the spiritual protocols that governed proper relationships with the animal spirits that provided guidance during the dangerous winter months. Traditional northern ceremonies included rituals that allowed hunters to access spiritual guidance from animal spirits during periods when game was scarce and survival depended upon supernatural assistance in locating food sources and avoiding the numerous dangers associated with extreme cold conditions. Corrupted practitioners perverted these ceremonies by seeking permanent access to animal consciousness without maintaining the spiritual discipline and moral restraints that prevented complete loss of human identity. The animal forms adopted by northern shapeshifters reflected the specific survival challenges associated with subarctic environments, with wolves, bears, and wolverines being the most commonly reported transformation shapes. Wolf forms provided enhanced pack hunting abilities that were particularly valuable during the winter months when large game animals were scarce and successful hunting required coordinated group efforts. Bear forms granted supernatural hibernation abilities that allowed shapeshifters to survive extended periods without food while maintaining their predatory capabilities, enabling them to emerge from winter dormancy with enhanced strength and supernatural hunting abilities. Wolverine forms represented a particularly feared category of northern shapeshifter transformation, as these animals possessed natural characteristics that made them ideally suited to surviving in harsh winter conditions while maintaining aggressive predatory behaviour throughout the coldest months. Wolverine-formed shapeshifters were described as being capable of travelling vast distances across snow-covered terrain without leaving tracks, approaching their victims during blizzards when normal human activity was impossible, and surviving in conditions that would prove fatal to both normal humans and most other animal forms. The Pacific Northwest tribal nations developed shapeshifter traditions that reflected their complex relationships with both terrestrial and marine environments, creating understanding of spiritual transformation that incorporated elements from both land-based and ocean-based spiritual practices. Tribes such as the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian possessed shapeshifter traditions that emphasized the connection between transformation abilities and the corruption of the ceremonial relationships governing fishing practices, whaling activities, and the spiritual protocols that maintained proper relationships with both land and sea animal spirits. The Pacific Northwest understanding of shapeshifter transformation involved the violation of the complex ceremonial systems that governed the harvesting of marine resources and the maintenance of proper relationships with the powerful spiritual entities that controlled ocean conditions and fish migrations. Traditional Pacific Northwest ceremonies included elaborate rituals that honoured salmon spirits during spawning runs, whale spirits during hunting expeditions, and the various spiritual entities that governed tidal patterns and seasonal changes in marine resource availability. Corrupted practitioners violated these protocols by overfishing, failing to perform proper gratitude ceremonies, or using marine resources for personal gain rather than community benefit. The animal forms adopted by Pacific Northwest shapeshifters reflected the dual nature of their environmental adaptation, with both terrestrial and marine forms being reported in traditional accounts. Orca forms represented one of the most powerful and feared categories of Pacific Northwest shapeshifter transformation, as these marine mammals possessed supernatural intelligence and social organization that made them formidable predators in oceanic environments, while granting them spiritual connections to the powerful forces that governed ocean conditions and weather patterns. Bear forms remained common among Pacific Northwest shapeshifters, but these transformations incorporated characteristics that reflected the region's abundant salmon runs and the complex relationships between bears and marine food sources. Pacific Northwest bear form shapeshifters were described as possessing enhanced fishing abilities that allowed them to harvest salmon with supernatural efficiency, while using their marine resource access to support extended predatory campaigns against human communities. Raven forms held particular significance within Pacific Northwest shapeshifter traditions due to the central role that these birds played in regional creation stories and their complex symbolism as both creator and trickster figures. Raven-form shapeshifters gained access to supernatural intelligence and the ability to manipulate both terrestrial and marine environments, making them particularly dangerous opponents who could coordinate complex attacks involving multiple environmental factors and animal allies. The environmental factors that influenced regional variations in shapeshifter traditions reflected the deep connections between indigenous spiritual practices and the specific geographical conditions that shaped each culture's relationship with the natural world. Desert environments produced shapeshifter traditions that emphasized survival in arid conditions and the supernatural abilities required to locate scarce water sources and navigate vast expanses of seemingly uniform terrain. Mountain environments created traditions that focused on supernatural climbing abilities, enhanced cold resistance, and the capacity to survive at high altitudes where normal human physiology would fail. Coastal environments generated shapeshifter traditions that incorporated both terrestrial and marine elements, reflecting the complex challenges associated with harvesting resources from both land and sea while navigating the dangerous conditions created by storms, tides, and seasonal changes in marine ecosystems. forest environments produced traditions that emphasized stealth, camouflage, and the ability to move through dense vegetation without creating disturbances that would alert potential prey or predators to the shapeshifter's presence. The cultural practices that influenced specific manifestations of spiritual transformation mythology reflected the unique values, social structures, and ceremonial systems that characterized different tribal nations. Agricultural societies developed shapeshifter traditions that emphasized the corruption of farming ceremonies and the violation of the spiritual protocols governing crop production and seasonal agricultural activities. Hunting societies created traditions that focused on the perversion of hunting ceremonies and the corruption of the spiritual relationships that governed proper interactions with game animals and their associated spiritual entities. Nomadic societies developed shapeshifter traditions that incorporated the challenges of constant movement and the need for supernatural abilities that functioned effectively across diverse geographical regions and environmental conditions. Settled societies created traditions that emphasized territorial defense and the protection of permanent communities against supernatural threats that might persist in specific locations over extended periods. The shapeshifting societies developed complex traditions that reflected their understanding of the fundamental spiritual forces governing existence itself, creating comprehensive frameworks that addressed not merely the immediate threat posed by corrupted individuals, but the deeper cosmic principles that made such corruption possible. These varied cultural expressions of Skinwalker mythology, despite their distinct regional characteristics and specific cultural adaptations, consistently pointed toward universal human concerns about the nature of spiritual power and the eternal responsibility that accompanied its use. The analysis of Skinwalker mythology across different tribal traditions reveals a sophisticated understanding of spiritual corruption that transcends simple, cautionary tales about individual moral failure. These traditions recognized that the capacity for both great good and terrible evil existed within every person who possessed access to spiritual power, creating an ongoing tension that required constant vigilance and community support to maintain in proper balance. The Skinwalker represented not merely an external threat, but an ever-present possibility that lurked within the spiritual development of anyone who sought to transcend normal human limitations through ceremonial practice and spiritual discipline. Traditional Diné teachings emphasized that the path towards spiritual corruption typically began with subtle violations of ceremonial protocol or minor abuses of spiritual authority that created small imbalances in the practitioner's relationship with the holy people. These initial transgressions might seem insignificant to outside observers, involving nothing more serious than charging excessive fees for healing ceremonies or using spiritual knowledge to gain unfair advantages in personal disputes. However, traditional understanding recognized that these minor violations created spiritual vulnerabilities that could be exploited by malevolent forces seeking to corrupt individuals who possessed valuable spiritual knowledge and ceremonial capabilities. The progression from minor spiritual infractions to complete corruption followed predictable patterns that traditional teachings described in detail, providing community members with the knowledge necessary to recognize the warning signs of spiritual degradation before they progressed to dangerous levels. The initial stages typically involve the gradual erosion of the practitioner's connection to positive spiritual influences, manifesting as reduced effectiveness in healing ceremonies, difficulty maintaining proper spiritual focus during ritual activities, and increasing isolation from the community relationships that normally provided spiritual support and accountability. As the corruption process advanced, affected individuals would begin displaying behavioral changes that reflected their growing disconnection from normal human empathy and moral restraint. They might become increasingly secretive about their ceremonial activities, reluctant to share their spiritual knowledge with appropriate students, or hostile toward other medicine people who questioned their methods or challenged their authority. These behavioral warning signs served as crucial early indicators that allowed communities to intervene with appropriate spiritual counseling and purification ceremonies before the corruption process reached irreversible stages. The role of community accountability in preventing spiritual corruption represented one of the most important aspects of traditional spiritual education, as individual practitioners required ongoing support and oversight from their communities to maintain proper spiritual balance throughout their careers. Traditional medicine people did not operate as isolated individuals, but functioned within complex networks of spiritual relationships that provided both support during difficult cases and accountability when their behavior or methods raised concerns about their spiritual condition. The training systems that produced traditional medicine people incorporated extensive instruction about the dangers of spiritual corruption and the specific practices that could lead to the loss of spiritual balance. Students learn not only the technical aspects of ceremonial procedures, but also the moral and spiritual principles that govern the proper use of spiritual power, developing the ethical framework necessary to resist the temptations that accompanied access to supernatural abilities. This comprehensive education recognized that technical competence without moral development created the conditions most likely to produce corrupted practitioners who would eventually threaten their own communities. The emphasis on collective spiritual responsibility within traditional communities reflected an understanding that the spiritual well-being of individual practitioners directly affected the safety and spiritual health of entire populations. A medicine person who succumbed to spiritual corruption did not simply harm themselves, but created ongoing threats to everyone within their sphere of influence, potentially affecting multiple generations through the spiritual contamination they spread and the protective systems they undermined through their corrupted activities. Traditional teaching stories served crucial functions in maintaining community awareness of the dangers associated with spiritual corruption, while providing detailed instruction about the warning signs and protective measures that could prevent such corruption from taking hold. These narratives were not simple entertainment, but sophisticated educational tools that conveyed complex spiritual concepts through memorable stories that could be easily transmitted across generations and adapted to address specific community needs and circumstances. The Skinwalker stories told within traditional Diné communities consistently emphasized the tragic nature of spiritual corruption, portraying the corrupted individuals not as inherently evil beings, but as people who had made terrible choices that gradually transformed their essential nature. These stories served as powerful reminders that the capacity for corruption existed within everyone who sought spiritual power, creating empathy for the corrupted individuals while simultaneously reinforcing the importance of maintaining proper spiritual discipline and community accountability. The educational function of Skinwalker mythology extended beyond simple moral instruction to encompass practical training in recognizing and responding to supernatural threats. Traditional stories provided detailed descriptions of Skinwalker abilities, hunting methods, and vulnerabilities that served as crucial survival information for community members who might encounter these entities. The stories taught listeners how to recognize the warning signs of Skinwalker presence, what protective measures could provide effective defense, and when it became necessary to seek help from qualified spiritual practitioners. The preservation of spiritual knowledge through oral tradition required sophisticated memory techniques and teaching methods that ensured accurate transmission of crucial information across multiple generations. The Skinwalker stories incorporated mnemonic devices, repetitive patterns, and memorable imagery that helped listeners retain complex spiritual concepts while maintaining the precise details necessary for effective application of protective measures and defensive strategies. Traditional communities recognized that the spiritual knowledge contained within Skinwalker stories was too important to be left to chance transmission, developing formal educational systems that ensured every community member possessed basic understanding of supernatural threats and appropriate responses. Children received age-appropriate instruction about spiritual dangers and protective practices, while adults continued their spiritual education throughout their lives to maintain current knowledge about evolving threats and defensive innovations. The role of Skinwalker stories in maintaining tribal spiritual knowledge extended beyond immediate practical applications to encompass the preservation of fundamental cosmological principles that govern traditional understanding of the relationship between human communities and the supernatural forces that influence their lives. These stories served as repositories for complex spiritual concepts that might otherwise be lost during periods of cultural disruption or social change, ensuring that crucial knowledge remained available to future generations even when traditional ceremonial systems faced external pressures or internal challenges. The integration of Skinwalker mythology into broader spiritual education systems reflected traditional understanding that supernatural threats could not be effectively addressed through isolated defensive measures but required comprehensive spiritual preparation that encompassed all aspects of community life. The stories provided frameworks for understanding how individual spiritual choices affected community well-being, how proper ceremonial practices maintain protective barriers against supernatural threats, and how collective spiritual discipline created the conditions necessary for long-term community survival and prosperity. Traditional respect for ceremonial boundaries and spiritual protocols represented one of the most crucial lessons conveyed through Skinwalker stories, as these narratives consistently demonstrated the terrible consequences that resulted from violating established spiritual laws. The stories taught that spiritual power operated according to precise principles that could not be safely ignored or modified according to individual preferences, emphasizing that traditional protocols had been developed through generations of experience with supernatural forces and represented accumulated wisdom about the safest and most effective methods for accessing spiritual power. The emphasis on maintaining proper relationships with spiritual entities reflected traditional understanding that human communities existed within complex networks of supernatural relationships that required ongoing attention and respect to function effectively. Skinwalker stories demonstrated how the violation of these relationships created spiritual imbalances that could affect entire communities, while also providing instruction about the ceremonial practices necessary to maintain proper spiritual connections and restore balance when disruptions occurred. The preservation of ancient wisdom about spiritual power and moral responsibility represented perhaps the most enduring significance of Skinwalker traditions, as these stories continue to provide relevant guidance for communities facing contemporary challenges while maintaining connections to traditional spiritual principles that had sustained indigenous cultures for countless generations. The stories served as bridges between ancient wisdom and modern circumstances, demonstrating how traditional spiritual concepts could be applied to address current needs while preserving the essential knowledge necessary for long-term cultural survival. The universal themes embedded within Skinwalker mythology transcended specific cultural boundaries to address fundamental human concerns about the nature of power, responsibility and moral choice that remained relevant across different historical periods and cultural contexts. The stories explored the eternal tension between individual ambition and community welfare, the dangerous allure of power without accountability, and the ongoing struggle between forces of creation and destruction that characterized human existence at both personal and collective levels. The enduring relevance of Skinwalker teachings reflected their foundation in deep psychological and spiritual truths about human nature that remained constant despite changing external circumstances. The stories addressed the universal human tendency to seek power and advantage over others, the challenges involved in maintaining moral integrity when faced with temptation, and the crucial importance of community support in helping individuals resist corrupting influences that could transform them into threats to their own people. The spiritual principles embedded within Skinwalker traditions provided frameworks for understanding the relationship between individual choices and collective consequences that remained applicable to contemporary ethical challenges. The stories demonstrated how seemingly minor moral compromises could lead to progressively more serious ethical violations, how the corruption of individuals in positions of trust could threaten entire communities, and how the maintenance of spiritual discipline required ongoing commitment and community support rather than isolated individual effort. The preservation of Skinwalker traditions within contemporary Indigenous communities reflected their continued recognition of these stories' value as sources of spiritual guidance and practical wisdom. Modern traditional practitioners continue to use Skinwalker stories as teaching tools that help community members understand the importance of maintaining proper spiritual balance, while providing practical instruction about recognizing and responding to various forms of spiritual corruption and supernatural threat. The academic study of Skinwalker mythology by anthropologists and religious scholars has revealed the sophisticated spiritual and psychological concepts embedded within these traditional narratives, demonstrating their value as sources of insight into Indigenous understanding of human nature, spiritual development, and community organization. These scholarly investigations have confirmed the complexity and depth of traditional Indigenous spiritual systems, while highlighting the continued relevance of ancient wisdom for addressing contemporary challenges related to power, responsibility, and moral choice. The integration of Skinwalker teachings into modern Indigenous education systems reflected ongoing efforts to preserve traditional spiritual knowledge while adapting ancient wisdom to address contemporary circumstances. Educational programs that incorporated Skinwalker stories provided young people with access to traditional spiritual concepts while demonstrating their continued relevance for understanding modern challenges related to ethical decision-making, community responsibility, and spiritual development. The Skinwalker tradition ultimately represents one of humanity's most profound explorations of the relationship between spiritual power and moral responsibility, providing insights into the eternal struggle between light and darkness that continues to shape human experience across cultures and historical periods. These ancient stories offer timeless wisdom about the choices that define human character, the importance of community accountability and maintaining moral standards, and the ongoing vigilance required to preserve the spiritual balance upon which human flourishing depends. Through their preservation and continued transmission, Skinwalker traditions ensure that future generations will have access to the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors about the most fundamental challenges facing anyone who seeks to transcend ordinary human limitations while maintaining their essential humanity and commitment to the welfare of their communities.